She was flat under a murderer's desk, the evidence pressed against her skin, not breathing while his boots moved 2 feet from her face. She had arrived in this town 4 days ago with 11 cents in a forged letter. She had nowhere to go, nothing to lose, and a dead man's name in her coat pocket. This is how she changed everything. She stepped down from the stagecoach into Colorado dust. And the first thing Lily Rose Brennan felt was the cold. Not the mountain cold, though, that was real enough, sharp and clean, and carrying the smell of pine resin, and something older, something mineral and permanent, like the bones of the earth pressing up through the soil. No, the cold she felt was the kind that lives in the chest, the kind that settles in when hope has been stretched too far for too long and finally quietly begins to tear. She was 24 years old. She had 11 cents in her coat pocket. She had a split lip that had stopped bleeding somewhere around the Kansas border and a bruise along her left cheekbone that had gone from red to purple to the yellowish green of something dying. She had a carpet bag in her right hand that held everything she owned in the world. And in her left hand, folded and refolded so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth, she held a letter. The town of Silverwood, Colorado Territory spread before her like an illustration from one of those dime novels she used to read by candlelight when she was young enough to believe that stories ended the way they were supposed to end. Wooden buildings lined a wide dirt street, their false fronts painted in faded colors that had once announced ambition and now simply announced survival. A general store, a livery stable, a blacksmith's forge already sending its rhythmic clanging out into the afternoon air. A boarding house 3 stories tall with a sign that read Murphy's Rooms in letters that had been repainted at least twice. And beyond all of it, indifferent and enormous and terrifyingly beautiful, the Rocky Mountains rose into a sky so blue it looked painted. Snow on the high peaks even now in early autumn. The kind of permanence that made everything human feel temporary. Lily had been on that stagecoach for 3 days. 3 days of rattling bones and dust in her teeth, and the driver's eyes finding her in the forward-facing mirror with a frequency that had nothing to do with professional concern. On the second night, when they stopped to water the horses at a station outside of a town whose name she never learned, he had come around to her side of the coach. She had already been awake. She had already been holding her father's old carpentry awl, the wooden handle smooth from decades of use, the steel point catching the moonlight. He had seen the point. He had seen her eyes. He had decided the money was not worth it. He had hated her for that decision every remaining mile, and she could still feel that hatred now standing in the Silverwood dust watching the stagecoach roll away down the main street toward the livery. She was used to that kind of hatred, the hatred of men who had been refused what they believed they deserved. She had been breathing that particular air her entire life. She smoothed her traveling dress with her free navy blue wool that had once been fine that her mother had sewn with careful hands during the winter before the coughing started. The dress showed every mile of the journey now, every stain, every mended tear, but she wore it straight and she held her chin at the angle her father had taught her, the angle that said, I am exactly where I mean to be, even when everything else in the world was screaming otherwise. She read the letter one more time. She had it memorized. Had memorized it the first night lying on the narrow bunk in her room in Philadelphia, the room she rented with the last of what she had left after Henry Clark had sold the carpentry business and drunk through the proceeds, and then when the creditors came, sold something else entirely. But she read it again anyway because there was something steadying in the act of reading, something that made the future feel real rather than imagined. Miss Brennan in the letter began, I am Jonah Stone, carpenter and mill owner in Silverwood, Colorado Territory. I require a wife to manage my household and help raise my young nephew. I can offer respectability, steady income, and a future. If you are of good character and willing to work, I believe we could make a fair arrangement. Arrive before month's end, Jonah Stone. No poetry, no promises of love or tenderness, or the kind of breathless hope that the younger version of herself had once briefly entertained. Just a transaction stated plainly between adults who understood the world as it actually was. Lily had read it 100 times and found something in its plainness that felt more honest than any flowery declaration could have. A man who wrote like this knew the difference between what he wanted and what he was willing to say. That was rarer than most people understood. She folded the letter back into her pocket. She picked up her carpet bag. She started walking toward the east end of town, where the letter said the workshop would be. The town was busier than she had expected for a weekday afternoon. Miners coming down from the high country, their faces weathered to leather by altitude, and wind moving in groups toward the saloon, with the particular focused purpose of men who had earned their thirst. Ranchers in for supplies loading wagon beds with flour sacks and coiled rope, and the hundred small necessities of isolated life. Women moving along the boardwalks with baskets and children in tow, pausing to exchange words in the shorthand of people who have known each other long enough to speak in fragments. A group of children played in the street, throwing a ball back and forth, their laughter carrying down the block with the bright, uncomplicated energy of people who had not yet learned to be afraid. A dog slept in a patch of sunlight outside the general store, one ear twitching at flies. A hammer rang against an anvil somewhere ahead, steady and purposeful as a heartbeat. Normal life, the kind of life that had nothing to do with hunger or fear or sleeping with an awl under your pillow, because the man who called himself your family had a way of looking at you after his third whiskey that made the locks on doors feel insufficient. Lily passed the boarding house. On the porch, a gray-haired woman swept dust into the street with a broom that had seen better days. The woman looked up as Lily passed. Their eyes met for a moment, and something passed between them in that look. The particular recognition that moves between women who have carried weight that no one else can see. The gray-haired woman nodded once. Lily nodded back. She kept walking. The east end of town was rougher. Fewer painted signs, more practical structures built for function rather than appearance. The blacksmith's forge she had heard from the center of town sat behind an open door, its glow visible even in the afternoon light. A stable yard held a dozen horses. And there, at the place where the town released its grip and the forest began to press back in, stood Stonewood Carpentry. It was larger than she had imagined. A two-story workshop with wide double doors, standing open to catch the late afternoon breeze. The kind of doors that had been built to move large pieces of finished furniture in and out without damage. Stacks of lumber filled the yard outside, organized with a precision that told her this was not a man who worked without thinking. White pine separated from oak from maple, each stack oriented to dry properly in the mountain air. A covered section held lumber too fine to risk weather damage, cherry wood and walnut, that had probably come up from Denver at considerable expense. From inside came the sound of a hand plane moving over wood. Long, even strokes. The sound of someone working not to finish a task, but because the work itself was worth doing carefully. Lily stood at the open doors for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the workshop's interior light. The space was cathedral-tall sawdust drifting in the beams of light that came through the high eastern windows like slow golden snow. Workbenches lined the walls, covered in tools that her fingers recognized even from a distance. Half-finished projects waited on stands and sawhorses. A staircase railing carved with a running vine motif, the leaves just detailed enough to suggest nature without trying to replicate it. A cabinet with fitted doors whose grain had been matched so carefully that the two pieces looked like a single continuous tree. A rocking chair that curved with the kind of ease that only came from understanding wood rather than fighting it. Her father would have wept to see this workshop. The man at the far bench had his back to her, tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing work pants and a shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows. Dark hair gone heavily gray at the temples and along the jaw, the gray of a man past 40 who had worked hard and grieved harder and not bothered to notice what either had taken from him. His hands moved the plane with the absolute assurance of someone for whom the motion had long since passed from skill into something closer to instinct. Before she could think about it, before she could arrange her expression or choose the right words or remember all the things she had rehearsed on the stagecoach, her right hand moved to her carpet bag and found the handle of her father's tool roll inside. Just the touch of it, the canvas worn soft, the small weight of the chisels and planes inside each one sitting in its own pocket, each one with its own particular heft and purpose. She breathed, she stepped forward, she cleared her throat. The planing stopped. The man set his tool down on the workbench with careful, deliberate precision, the way a person sets something down when they want to be sure they are completely finished with one thing before they begin another. Then he turned. Jonah Stone looked like he had been carved from the same wood he worked. All hard angles and weathered lines. The kind of face that had been good-looking once and was still arresting now, but had been worked over by something internal, something that had taken up residence behind the eyes and changed everything else by its presence. His eyes were gray, not the pale gray of clouds or water, but the deeper gray of stone of mountain granite that has been there longer than anyone living can remember. He was past 40, well past it, but his face had the quality of something that had been worked rather than simply aged, and the difference made the number feel irrelevant. Those eyes moved over her, professionally almost, taking in the split lip, the bruised cheekbone, the stained dress, the carpet bag, her hands, which were not the soft hands of a Philadelphia drawing room, but the hands of a person who had worked, had always worked, had learned early that work was the only honest currency. His expression did not change. But something shifted behind those stone gray eyes, something too fast and too small to name. She straightened her spine. "I'm Lily Brennan," she said. She had spent the last 50 miles making sure her voice would come out steady, and it did. "From Philadelphia, I received your letter." She held it out. He took it, read it. His jaw tightened on the second paragraph. By the third paragraph, she could see the tendons in his forearms, and she understood what that tightening meant before he spoke. He handed the letter back to her. "I didn't write this." The words entered her chest like something structural failing, like a beam giving way. She had prepared for hostility, for coldness, for a man who was less than his letter suggested. She had not prepared for this. "I don't understand." The words came out smaller than she intended. "Your name is on it, your business." "Someone used my name." His voice was flat final. "That's not my handwriting. Let me see it again." She gave it back, watched his face while he examined it more carefully. This time saw the anger that moved through him like a current, controlled but real. "This paper." He turned it over, held it to the light coming through the window. "I have paper like this, same stock." His jaw worked for a moment. "Vincent Kane was in here last month asking about a cabinet commission that never materialized. I noticed some sheets were missing and assumed I'd miscounted." He handed the letter back. "He did this." "Why, because I won't sell him my land, because men like Kane use whatever tools come to hand." He turned back to his workbench. "I'm sorry, Miss Brennan. Genuinely sorry you traveled all this way. But I can't help you. I don't need a wife. I'm not in a position to take on anyone else's welfare." There was something in those last words, a weight that went beyond her particular situation, a weight that had been accumulating for a long time before she ever stepped off that stagecoach. She heard it. She filed it away without showing that she had. "Please." She had not planned to say that word. She had planned to be practical, to make her case on the basis of usefulness and capability, to never once sound desperate. But the word came out before she could stop it, and once it was out, she finished what it had started. "I have nowhere to go. I have 11 cents. I can work. I'm strong. I know carpentry. I can do whatever you need. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a chance to earn." "I said I can't help you." "Uncle Jonah." The voice came from the back of the workshop, from behind a stack of maple that was drying near the rear wall. A child's voice, bright and direct, carrying the particular confidence of someone who had not yet learned that adults preferred not to be interrupted. A boy appeared from behind the lumber, 10 years old maybe, all elbows and forward momentum, dark hair like Jonah's, but with lighter eyes that took in everything at once, without the protective distance that Jonah had built over whatever years had required it. He looked at Lily with the open assessment of a child who had not yet decided what he was supposed to see. "Who's that? Nobody, Tommy." Jonah's voice shifted when he addressed the boy, just slightly, the flatness softening by a degree that was noticeable precisely because everything else about him was so carefully level. "Go back to your sanding." "But she looks like she needs help." Tommy moved closer, looking up at Lily with direct and uncomplicated concern. "Did someone hit you?" "Tommy," Jonah's voice firmed, "inside, now." The boy hesitated for exactly as long as he could without it becoming defiance, then disappeared through a door that led to what must have been the attached living quarters. The door closed with the careful quietness of someone who wanted to remain invisible, but his words stayed in the air. "Did someone hit you?" Jonah was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, some of the flatness had changed quality. It was still flat, still closed, but there was something underneath it now that had not been there before. The boarding house on the main street. Murphy's rooms. The woman who runs it is named Kate. Tell her I sent you. She may have something. I told you I have 11 cents. Tell her I'll cover the first week. I don't want your charity, Mr. Stone. It's not charity. It's the cost of Vincent Kane's bad behavior. He picked up the plane again. The conversation was over. I'm sorry, Miss Brennan. I truly am. She stood there for a moment longer than was comfortable. Stood in that beautiful workshop that smelled of her entire childhood. Stood with her father's tools in her bag and 11 cents in her pocket and nowhere on earth to go, and looked at the back of a man who had built something real and good and was protecting it from being touched by anything. Even help, even hope. Then she picked up her carpet bag. She walked back out into the Colorado afternoon. The sun had moved since she arrived. It sat lower now, throwing long shadows off the western false fronts, turning the dust in the street amber and gold. The mountains above the town had shifted too, the afternoon light pulling their contours into sharper relief, every ridge and snowfield rendered in the kind of clarity that felt almost aggressive in its beauty. Lily stood on the packed dirt outside the workshop for 3 full seconds, which was as long as she allowed herself. Then she started walking toward Murphy's rooms. She was halfway down the main street when she heard her own name. Not her own name, the wrong name. Her father's name. A man's voice coming from the open door of the blacksmith's forge as she passed. Brennan, what kind of Brennan? She stopped, turned toward the doorway. Inside the forge, an old man stood at the cooling end of a workbench, a piece of ironwork in one hand and a cloth in the other, looking at her with an expression she could not immediately read. White-haired, bent slightly at the shoulders, but with arms that still carried 40 years of metalwork in their thickness. His eyes were sharp under eyebrows that had grown into small thickets with age. I heard you tell Jonah your name, he said by way of explanation. His voice had the slow, careful quality of someone choosing words after long practice. I was in the yard. I wasn't eavesdropping. Well, a beat. I was, but only because I heard Brennan. That's my name, she said. Lily Brennan. My father was Michael Brennan. He had a carpentry business in Philadelphia. The man set down the iron piece and the cloth with the careful movements of someone managing a response that was larger than they wanted to show. He gripped the edge of the workbench with one large hand, and Lily noticed the knuckles go white before he controlled that too. Michael, he said. The word sounded like he was testing its weight. Michael Brennan. Did you know him? A pause that held more inside it than she could see. Knew him. The old man looked at her for a long moment. Worked with him back before he went east, back before any of this. He gestured vaguely at the forge, at the town, at everything the gesture could mean. We were partners, him and me, and a man named Isaiah Stone. Isaiah was Jonah's father. The afternoon went quiet around her in a way that had nothing to do with the actual sounds of the town. Partners, she repeated. I'm Tom Fletcher. He stuck out the calloused hand that was not still gripping the workbench. Been in this town since before most of these buildings were standing. He shook her hand with a grip that still had force in it. You're Michael Brennan's daughter. I am. Tom Fletcher looked at her for a long time, and in that look she saw something moving behind the sharp old eyes, something that had been kept in a specific place for a long time and was now stirring. There are things you need to know, he said finally. Things about your father and this town and what happened here before you were born. Things I've been holding for 30 years waiting for. He paused, seemed to reconsider how he was going to finish that sentence. Waiting for the right time, the right person. Tell me now. Not here. He glanced toward the street, the practiced glance of someone who had learned to check before speaking. Not standing in the open. Come back at sundown. I'll tell you everything. He looked at her with something that was not quite pity, but was adjacent to it, something softer and older. Your father was the best carpenter I ever knew, Miss Brennan. The best I ever saw, and I've seen a lot. I'm sorry he's gone. How did you know he was gone? Something crossed his face. Kate Murphy told me you'd come in asking about work at the boarding house. She keeps track of things. A pause. How long has he been gone? 2 years. Tom Fletcher nodded. Sundown, he said again. Come back at sundown. She arrived at Murphy's rooms 20 minutes later. The gray-haired woman from the porch was in the front room when she pushed through the door, moving between the dining room and what appeared to be a small office with the efficiency of someone who had been running a busy establishment for decades and had long since optimized every motion. She looked up when Lily entered, and the same assessment that had happened from the porch happened again, now more thoroughly in better light. "Jonah Stone sent you," the woman said. It was not a question. "He said you might have work." The woman set down whatever she was carrying. "Kate Murphy." She extended her hand. "I own this place." Her handshake was dry and strong, the handshake of someone who believed that information was communicated through contact. "You're the girl from the letter. You know about the letter? Whole town will know by morning. Vincent Kane doesn't do anything quietly." Kate's expression did something complicated. "He likes an audience. Always has." She looked at Lily's face, at the split lip and the bruised cheek. "That wasn't Kane." "No, the stagecoach driver." Kate's mouth pressed together. "How much do you have?" 11 cents. Kate was quiet for a moment. "Then can you cook, actually cook, not the kind of cooking that means you stood near a stove once?" "I can cook. Peel potatoes without taking half the potato with the skin. I can peel potatoes. Carry 6 plates at once without losing one. I've never tried 6. You'll learn." Kate picked up what she'd set down. "Supper service at 6. 12 boarders, most of them miners who eat like they're trying to fill a mine shaft. You work tonight and clean up after I give you a meal and a bed in the attic. Tomorrow we talk about something more permanent." She paused. "The attic is small and it gets cold, but it's clean, and the lock on the door works." The last detail was not incidental, and both of them knew it. "Thank you," Lily said. "Don't thank me yet." Kate was already moving. "I work my help harder than they expect." "That's all right," Lily said. "I'm harder to break than I look." Kate stopped walking, turned back, studied Lily with the particular attention of someone who has learned to distinguish between the thing people say and the thing they mean. "Yes," Kate said finally, simply as if confirming something she had already suspected. "I think you might be." The work of the next 3 hours was exactly what Lily needed, which was to say, it was exhausting and mindless, and left no space in her head for anything except the immediate task in front of her. She peeled potatoes until her hands ached. She stirred an enormous pot of beef stew that smelled of juniper and bay leaf, and the particular richness of meat that had been cooking slowly all day. She sliced bread from loaves that Kate had baked that morning and carried plates of butter and pickled vegetables out to the long table in the dining room as the boarders began filing in at 6 o'clock exactly. They came in from the street, stamping trail dust from their boots. 12 men ranging from a boy of maybe 17 to a man who had to be past 65, all of them wearing the particular purposeful blankness of people at the end of a long day who wanted food more than conversation. Miners mostly with the wide forearms and the slightly rounded backs that came from spending the majority of your hours bent over in a shaft, but also 2 men who were clearly merchants, a doctor who came in reading a letter and kept reading it all through the meal, and 1 man who was later than the rest. He came in after the others had already filled their plates, moving to the corner table with the ease of someone accustomed to making an entrance, even a small one. His suit was too expensive for Silverwood. His hair was oiled back with a precision that required either a very good mirror or someone else to help. He sat down and looked across the room at Lily with the particular quality of attention that she had learned over many years to recognize immediately. It was the attention of a man calculating what something was worth. "Well now." His voice was smooth and cultivated, the voice of someone who had grown up somewhere else and practiced the removal of where he came from. "Kate's got new help, and prettier than the last." Kate appeared from the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on her apron, her expression the flat, unapologetic neutrality of someone who was done pretending certain things were acceptable. "Leave her be, Kane." Kane. Vincent Kane. The name landed in Lily's chest like a thrown stone. She set down the water pitcher she was carrying very carefully. She set it down because her hands had for a single moment wanted to do something else with it, and she was not a person who acted on that kind of impulse. She was a person who made decisions and then acted on the decisions. So she set the pitcher down on the table nearest to her, and then she turned and looked at Vincent Kane with her full attention, and she understood immediately why Jonah Stone had said his name with the particular tone a person uses for something that has cost them considerably. He was perhaps 40, perhaps a few years past it preserved by money, in the way that money sometimes preserved people beyond their actual age. Good-looking in the way that a man could be good-looking when he had enough money to maintain himself and enough power to never have to be uncomfortable. His smile had too many teeth in it, and his eyes were doing something other than what a smile was supposed to do. Just being friendly, Kate. No harm in friendly. Your version of friendly usually ends with someone getting hurt. Kate's voice did not change pitch or speed. Kitchen, she said to Lily. Now. But Lily did not go to the kitchen. She stood at the table and she looked at Vincent Kane, and she thought about the 3 days on the stagecoach, about the 11 cents, about the look on Jonah Stone's face when he had read that letter, the look of a man discovering that someone had broken into his house and rearranged the furniture to make him look like a fool. You're Vincent Kane, she said. Her voice was conversational, almost pleasant. His expression shifted just slightly, the calculation reassessing itself. My reputation precedes me. You sent a letter to Philadelphia. You forged Jonah Stone's name. You made me believe there was a man here who needed what I had to offer. You spent money on a stamp and a few minutes on someone else's stationery, and it cost me everything I had. The dining room had gone quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when everyone has simultaneously decided that listening is more interesting than eating. 12 men with their forks frozen somewhere between plate and mouth. Kane looked around the room with the ease of a man who had never in his life been afraid of an audience. Then he looked back at Lily with something that was probably the closest he got to embarrassment, which was to say, it was not very close at all. Well, he said, dabbing at his mouth with a napkin, in a gesture so precisely calibrated to seem casual that it became its opposite. I suppose that is somewhat unfortunate. I thought Jonah could use a little disruption in his routine. I didn't think anyone would actually travel all this way based on a promise. Her voice had not risen. She was proud of that. On the kind of promise that a person in a desperate situation reaches for because it is the only thing being offered. On the kind of promise that someone with your particular kind of power makes as a joke because you have enough of everything that you have forgotten what nothing feels like. The room was very quiet. Kane set the napkin down. The smile changed quality. Careful, girl. I run the largest lumber operation in this county. I have relationships with every merchant in this town, the sheriff included. You insult me in public on your first day here, and you'll find that Silverwood can become a very small and very difficult place. Then I'll have insulted you, Lily said, and I'll deal with whatever comes after. He stood. He was taller than she'd registered, and he used the height deliberately moving close enough that she could smell the pomade in his hair and the bourbon under the cologne. You'll come begging eventually, he said. His voice had dropped to something that was almost intimate, almost kind, which made it considerably worse. They always do. The ones who come out here with nothing thinking courage is a substitute for practicality. I'll still be here when you've run out of places to turn, and my offer will still be the best one available. He left. His boots made a particular sound on the wooden floor, the sound of deliberate authority of a man who had learned to occupy space as a form of communication. The door did not slam. It closed with a precise, considered quietness that was somehow more final than a slam would have been. The dining room stayed silent for another moment. Then slowly the forks began to move again. Conversations resumed in the low register of men who had witnessed something they were still processing. Kate appeared at Lily's shoulder. Her voice was pitched for Lily alone. Come with me. In the kitchen away from the boarders, Kate turned to face her with an expression that had moved past neutrality into something harder to read. That was brave, Kate said. Or stupid, I haven't decided which. Both, probably. Kate made a sound that was not quite a laugh but lived in the same neighborhood. He'll make things difficult. He already controls enough of this town that if he decides to close doors, doors close. She paused. He put Walter out of work once for 6 months just because Walter told someone at the assayer's office that Kane's timber measurements didn't add up. Walter is your son. Something moved through Kate's face, something that had clearly moved through it many times before and had worn a groove in doing so. Was. Lily did not ask the follow-up question. She did not need to. He owned Kane's mill, Kate said after a moment. He noticed things, Walter. He was careful and precise, and he noticed things. He noticed that some of the timber Kane was supplying for a contract bridge the county was paying to build across Silver Creek, some of it was rotten. Not aging rotten, but deliberately sourced rotten, the kind you use when you want to make the margin on a government contract large enough to matter. Walter told him it would fail, told him there'd be injuries. Kate's hands were moving the way hands moved when they had nothing to do, and needed to anyway, straightening things on the counter that were already straight. A month later, Walter had an accident at the mill. A log came down wrong. She stopped straightening. The sheriff ruled it bad luck. Lily stood with that for a moment. Does Jonah know about the bridge timber? Jonah knows what everyone in this town knows, which is everything and nothing. He knows Kane is dangerous. He knows Kane wants his land. He knows to be careful. Kate looked at her directly. What he doesn't know, what none of them know, is that Tom Fletcher has been keeping something for 30 years that might change the entire story. And now Tom has told you he'll tell you at sundown. Lily went very still. How do you know about that? Because Tom has been trying to tell that story for 30 years and never found the right person to tell it to. Kate picked up a dishcloth, set it back down. Maybe now he has. Lily spent the rest of the supper service in a state that felt like two separate experiences running parallel to each other. On the surface, she was competent and present, carrying plates and refilling pitchers and clearing the table as the boarders finished their meals and drifted back to their rooms. Underneath, she was moving through the implications of what she had learned in a single afternoon. Jonah Stone had not sent the letter. He was a man living inside grief-building walls, against caring about anything else. He had a nephew who asked direct questions about bruises. His father had been in a partnership that had ended badly 30 years ago, and Tom Fletcher knew why. Vincent Kane wanted Stone's land and was willing to use people as tools to get it. And somewhere at the root of it, something connected her father's name to all of it in a way she did not yet understand. Kate showed her to the attic room when the last dish was washed and the dining table was set for morning. It was a small room with a ceiling that followed the pitch of the roof, a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a window that looked out over the main street, clean as Kate had promised. The lock on the door was solid and functional, as Kate had also promised. Lily sat on the edge of the bed and opened her carpet bag. She took out Clara's coat first, the small wool coat that had belonged to her sister dead at 8, from consumption because medicine cost $8, and Lily had only had 3. The coat still held the faint ghost of lavender from the cedar chest where their mother had kept it. She pressed it against her face for a moment, breathing whatever remained. Then she took out her father's tool roll, unrolled it on the bed beside her. 14 tools in their individual canvas pockets, each one placed where her hands could find it without looking, as her father had placed them, as she had placed them 1,000 times since. She ran her index finger along the edge of the smallest plane. Still sharp. She had kept them sharp the way he had taught her through the months after his death, when she had been pawning everything else. She had kept these sharp and ready, and with her. She thought about Jonah Stone's face when he had read the letter, the way his hands had gone still on the plane, the way he had said with a controlled anger that was somehow more affecting than any raised voice, "This isn't my handwriting." She thought about Tommy asking if someone had hit her. She thought about Tom Fletcher's hands going white on the workbench when she said her father's name. She thought about what Kate had not said, that Tom had been waiting 30 years for the right person, and what it meant that a woman named Brennan had walked into Silverwood on the same day Vincent Kane was applying pressure on Jonah Stone, and a town council hearing was 5 days away. Outside the window, the mountains were a black cutout against a sky full of stars, the kind of sky you never saw in Philadelphia, the kind that made the universe feel immediate rather than theoretical. Somewhere in the dark below the window, a wolf called once and fell silent. Lily rolled her father's tools back into their canvas pockets, each one in its place. She lay down on the narrow bed with Clara's coat folded against her chest, and she stared at the pitched ceiling. And she thought about what Tom Fletcher was going to tell her at sundown the following evening. And she thought about what it meant that her father, a man who had never in her memory spoken about any life before Philadelphia, had apparently had a partner named Isaiah Stone, and a history in Colorado that he had carried silently to his grave. She thought about the way Tom Fletcher had gripped the workbench. She thought about the particular weight and how he'd said Michael was a good man. Past tense, as if he'd known for a long time that it needed to be past tense. She thought about what it meant to keep a secret for 30 years, what it cost. What kind of truth could be worth that cost? Sleep came late and left early, but it came because she was young and exhausted, and because there was nothing else she could do in the dark except rest for whatever tomorrow required. In the morning she had work to begin. The morning came in through the attic window at an angle that had nothing gentle about it. Lily was already awake when it arrived. She had been awake for some time, lying on the narrow bed in the particular stillness of a person who has finished sleeping but has not yet decided to begin moving, listening to the sounds of Silverwood and assembling itself for another day. A horse somewhere on the main street, the distant percussion of Tom Fletcher's forge starting up that first ringing strike against cold iron that would continue at intervals throughout the day like a slow mechanical heartbeat. Kate moving below in the kitchen, the particular cadence of a woman who had been running a boarding house long enough that her morning routine had become a kind of music. She dressed in the green wool dress, her second and slightly less worn option, braided her hair into something that would hold through a working day and went downstairs. Kate had set aside a plate, eggs and bacon and a slice of bread, still warm from the oven, sitting on the far end of the kitchen counter, away from the boarder's breakfast service. No comment attached to it, no ceremony, just food placed where Lily would find it. It was one of the more articulate gestures of practical kindness that Lily had encountered in some time, and she ate it standing at the counter quickly in the manner of someone who had learned not to assume that the food in front of them would still be there if they waited. "Deliveries first," Kate said, moving past her with a stack of folded linens. "I meant for 3 businesses in town. Tom Fletcher's Forge Dock Cross above the general store and the saloon on the west end. Tom's first. He opens early." She set the stack on the counter beside Lily's plate. "After that, walk the main street. Introduce yourself to whoever will talk to you. People need to know you're here to work, not just to cause trouble, even if causing trouble was Kane's plan and not yours." A pause. "Especially then. And at sundown," Kate looked at her, "Tom will tell you what he knows. And then we'll see what there is to see." She handed Lily a basket, added the linens, and said nothing else. The morning air outside was cold enough to make Lily's breath visible the sky above the mountains, a deep particular blue that existed at altitude in autumn and nowhere else. The town was coming alive around her shopkeepers, pushing open their doors and sweeping last night's dust into the street, a group of miners heading up slope toward the high country with their gear on their backs, a woman hanging washing on a line between 2 buildings with the focused efficiency of someone with 12 other tasks waiting. Tom Fletcher's forge was exactly where Kate had described it, stone-built and already warm when Lily pushed through the open door into the smell of hot metal and coal smoke. The old man stood at the forge with his back to the entrance, working a piece of iron with a concentration that didn't acknowledge her arrival for a full 10 seconds, which she suspected was his way of establishing that he finished what he started before he began something new. Then he set the iron down on the anvil and turned. He looked different in the morning light than he had the previous afternoon. Older somehow, and also more deliberate, as if the hours between had allowed him to settle into a decision. "Linens from Kate," Lily said, holding up the basket. "Set them there." He pointed to a bench near the door. "Then you sleep some." "Good." He moved to the workbench, picked up a rag, began wiping his hands with the slow thoroughness of a man buying time to think. "I want to show you something before tonight. Something that will help you understand what I have to tell you." He gestured to the corner of the forge. "Come here." On the workbench in the corner, where the morning light came in strongest through the single east-facing window, sat the wedding chest she had noticed the day before, the metalwork gleaming, the wooden panels still rough and poorly fitted. But today there was something else beside it, a rolled tube of papers tied with a piece of twine that had been knotted and unknotted so many times it had gone soft. "Before I untie that," Tom said, "I want you to look at the chest. Tell me what you see." Lily set down the basket. She moved to the workbench and looked at the chest the way her father had taught her to look at things, which was not at the surface but through it, at the structure underneath, at the decisions that had been made in the making of it. "The metalwork is exceptional," she said. "The hinges are mortised and not surface mounted. The lock plate has been set flush, which means the lid will close without binding, even if the wood moves seasonally. She ran her finger along one of the panel joints. But the wood is wrong. The panels are just butted together. No rabbet, no groove, no compensation for expansion. When the humidity changes, and it changes a lot at this altitude, the joints will open up. Moisture will get in. In 5 years, the whole thing warps, and none of the metalwork matters. Tom was watching her with the focused attention of someone taking notes. What would you do, Wham? Rabbet the inside edges. Cut a groove in each panel so they interlock rather than just sit against each other. Add a small spline if the wood is particularly prone to movement. She paused, fingers still resting on the joint. And the wood itself needs to be read before you cut it. This maple has some tension in it. You can see it in the way the grain shifts here. You'd cut with that tension, not against it. Otherwise, you're fighting the wood every step. Tom Fletcher was quiet for a moment. Your father said almost exactly those words, he said. The last time I saw him, we were looking at a door frame that was giving trouble, and he put his hand on the wood and said, "You have to work with what the wood wants to do, not what you want it to do." He untied the twine on the rolled papers. 30 years ago, I remember it exactly. He unrolled the papers on the workbench beside the chest, weighting the corners with tools to keep them flat. They were architectural plans, hand-drawn in the careful, dense style of someone who understood that a plan was a promise you made to the material before you touched it. Two sets of handwriting appeared in the margins, a mixture of annotations and formula notations and measurements that had been added to the drawings over time, a conversation conducted in pencil between two people working on the same problem. This bridge, Tom said, laying his hand flat on the largest drawing, Silver Creek crossing 3 miles east of town. Your father and Isaiah Stone designed it together. They'd been working on a waterproofing formula for the timber, something that would let bridge lumber last 20 years instead of 7. The formula is in these margins. He pointed to the dense notations, two distinct hands interweaving. Isaiah's numbers here, Michael's here. They were close, a few months away from having something worth patenting. And Gerald Pike, Tom's expression did what expressions did when the name arrived. A tightening, a settling in. Pike was a laborer, smart, ambitious, the kind of ambitious that sits quiet and watches and waits. He was in that workshop every day for 2 years. He saw everything. He understood more than he let on. Tom rolled one corner of the drawing back, slightly pointing to a specific section of the formula notation. See how the bottom of this page is missing? Torn away cleanly, the final mixture ratios, the part that made the formula work rather than just interesting. Someone took it. Someone took it the night Isaiah Stone died. Lily looked at the torn edge. Straight, deliberate, the cut of a blade rather than the tear of urgency. September 1858, Tom said. I was working late at the forge, which is across town. I heard the collapse, or what I was told was a collapse. A support beam in the workshop, they said. Isaiah was working alone. By the time anyone got there, he was already gone. He folded his hands on the workbench. 2 things happened in the days after. Michael Brennan came to see me. He was frightened. He said Pike had been at the workshop the evening Isaiah died, said he'd seen him there, and that Pike had looked at him in a way that said he knew Michael had seen him. He said he was leaving, going back east, back to family. He said to tell Isaiah's family he was sorry, to tell young Jonah he was sorry. Tom paused. Jonah was 19, just him and that workshop and no idea how to run it. And then Michael left, and I never heard from him again. Tom looked at her steadily. I assumed he made it to Philadelphia, built a new life, changed his name the way he said he might to be safe from Pike. I assumed he was alive somewhere, guilty about leaving, but alive. A pause that had something careful in it. I assumed that for 30 years. Lily heard what he was not saying. But you don't assume that anymore. Tom did not answer immediately. He re-rolled the papers, retied the twine with the same careful repetition of a man who had handled these documents many times. There are things I think, he said finally, that I have no proof of. And there are things I know, which is that Michael Brennan was a good man who was frightened of a dangerous one. And there is a gap between those 2 things that I have never been able to fill. He looked up. Maybe you can help fill it. He held out the rolled papers. She took them. She was still thinking about the gap when she finished the other deliveries dock cross above the general store, receiving his linens with the distracted courtesy of a man whose mind was always in the previous appointment. The saloon on the West End requiring the kind of careful navigation around three morning drinkers that Kate had warned her about, and that Lily handled with the particular combination of pleasantness and absolute clarity that she had developed over years of managing situations involving men and limited options. She was back at the boarding house by mid-morning, the basket empty, the tube of plans under her arm, and Kate waiting for her in the kitchen with an expression that said news had arrived. Jonah sent word, Kate said. Tommy needs a tutor, someone to work with him on reading and arithmetic afternoons. And the workshop needs organizing, the kind of detailed sorting and inventory work that Jonah doesn't have time for when he's on commission. $3 a week. She paused. And there's a small cabin behind the workshop if you want it, or you can stay here. His exact words, as relayed by Tommy, who came to tell me, were that he's offering work, not charity, and that if she doesn't want it, she doesn't have to take it. Lily thought about the workshop, about the smell of it, about the half-finished rocking chair that curved like a dancer. I'll take the she said. I'll stay here for now. Kate nodded as if she had expected that answer. Go this afternoon. Tommy will be back from school by 2. She went at 2. Tommy was waiting on the front step of the workshop when she arrived, his school slate under one arm, looking up the street with the slightly overdone casualness of a child who has been watching for someone but does not want to admit it. When he saw Lily coming, he stood up with a speed that demolished the pretense entirely. You came, he said. I said I would. Uncle Jonah says people say things they don't mean all the time. He's not wrong, but when I say something, I mean it. Tommy considered this with the serious assessment of a child sorting new information into existing categories. Then he pushed the workshop door open and led her inside. Jonah was at the far bench, bent over a technical drawing, a carpenter's pencil moving across the paper in quick, precise marks. He looked up when they came in. His expression was not warm, but it was not the closed, flat wall of the previous day either. Something had shifted in it slightly, the way a door shifts when someone has touched the latch without opening it. $3 a week, he said. Tommy in the afternoons. Inventory and sorting in the mornings. The stain cabinet needs cataloging. The tool storage in the back needs reorganizing by type rather than whoever put things wherever they fit last. And if you find something that needs repair, note it, but don't touch it until you ask me. Understood. He looked at her for a moment longer than the transaction required. Then he looked back at his drawing. Tommy pulled her toward the back of the workshop, where a clear space had been set up with a workbench that had been repurposed as a desk, a stool, and a second slate beside his own. He set this up this morning, Tommy said, in the conspiratorial tone of someone reporting intelligence. Before I went to school, he moved the lumber that used to be here. Lily looked at the cleared space, at the 2 slates, at the deliberate, practical care of Ed. All right, she said, show me what you're working on. The afternoon moved in the particular rhythm of learning, which was not smooth but had its own momentum, a series of small resistances overcome, understandings achieved and then lost and then re-achieved from a slightly different angle. Tommy was bright in the way that children were bright when their intelligence had not found its proper channel yet, when it was running in all directions at once, without a structure to concentrate it. He knew things that were not on the slate because he had absorbed them from the workshop around him, could tell her the difference between hard maple and soft maple by feel, understood intuitively why you measured twice, but the formal symbols of arithmetic confused him, and the letters in his reading primer seemed to him arbitrary and resistant to meaning. Why does the B look like the D but mean something different? He asked with the tone of someone raising a legitimate grievance. Because the person who invented them was trying to make things difficult for everyone who came after. Tommy looked at her. Really? No, but it's a reasonable theory. She turned the primer to a page with a short paragraph. Here's the thing about letters. They're just shapes that make sounds. The B makes one sound and the D makes a different sound, and once you've heard them enough times, your brain stops seeing shapes and starts hearing sounds. It just takes practice. How much practice? Enough that it stops feeling like practice and starts feeling like reading. Tommy looked skeptical, but he put his finger on the first word. From across the workshop, Jonah's pencil kept moving. But once, when Lily glanced up from the primer, she caught him looking in their direction, and he looked back at his drawing with the speed of someone who had not intended to be caught. She kept the observation to herself. At the end of the afternoon, when Tommy had worked through 3 pages of the primer and 2 columns of multiplication that he had needed to stop and restart 4 times before the pattern revealed itself to him, he looked up at Lily with the particular expression of a child who has decided to ask a real question. Did someone take care of you when you were learning things? She thought about her father's workshop in Philadelphia, the smell of oak shavings, his hands guiding hers on the chisel handle. Yes, she said, for a while. What happened? He died. Tommy was quiet for a moment. He understood death the way children understood it, when it had been specific and recent, not as an abstraction, but as the particular absence of particular people. My parents died, he said. The mine. I know, I'm sorry. Uncle Jonah doesn't talk about it. He turned the primer over in his hands, not reading it, just handling it. He doesn't talk about Aunt Anna either. Or Ruth, he just works. A pause. Kate says grief makes people go inside themselves, like a house that pulls all the curtains closed. Lily thought about Jonah setting the plane down with precise care before he turned to face her. About the way he'd said, I can't take on anyone else's welfare, and the weight that those words carried. Sometimes people close the curtains because the light hurts, she said. It doesn't mean they want to be in the dark. Tommy thought about this. Then do you think he'll open them again? I think he might be starting to. She said it without thinking about it, and then thought about it after it was out and found that she believed it was true. She left the workshop at 5 and walked quickly back toward the forge. The afternoon light had gone amber, the shadows along the mountains in the east already losing their detail to dusk. Tom Fletcher was banking his fire for the evening when she arrived, the forge cooling from the day's work, the air inside still carrying its metallic warmth. He had set out 2 chairs near the workbench. He had set out a lamp. He poured coffee from a pot on the cooling forge's edge and handed her a cup, and then he sat down and folded his hands and looked at her with the expression of someone who has rehearsed a thing many times and is now putting the rehearsed version aside in favor of the real one. Your father and Isaiah Stone and I came to Colorado in 1855, Tom began. We were young men. Isaiah was a carpenter, already trained in Boston, good enough to be excellent anywhere he chose to work. Michael was learning under him, a partnership of mentor and apprentice that had shifted into something more equal as Michael's talent revealed itself. I was a blacksmith, newly trained, and we had the idea that in the territories in a town building itself from nothing, a carpenter and a blacksmith who could work together would be worth considerably more than either could be alone. He paused, turning his coffee cup in his hands. We were right. Silverwood was 3 years old when we arrived. Everything still needed building. Isaiah and Michael had more work than they could manage, and I was making tools and ironwork for half the construction going on in the county. We were not rich, but we were comfortable in growing. Isaiah married head Jonah. Michael was saving money with the intention of eventually going back east, finding a wife, building something lasting. And Pike came to us in 1856. He presented himself well, educated some experience with woodwork, asked to apprentice under Isaiah. He was industrious and careful and kept himself to himself, and for nearly 2 years, we had no reason to think anything of him, except that he was ambitious in a way that sometimes made the air in a room feel different. Tom's voice did not change in tone or speed, but the words themselves had changed quality. I understand now, looking back, that the ambition was not directed outward. It wasn't ambition for a life he wanted to build. It was ambition directed at something specific that he wanted to take. The formula. The formula. Isaiah had been working on waterproofing treatments for outdoor timber since before I knew him. He understood that Bridgewood failing was not just an economic problem, but a moral one. People trusted those structures with their lives. He wanted to solve it properly. Michael contributed the way Michael contributed to everything, by seeing angles that others missed, by being patient with the problem until the problem showed him its logic. Tom set down his coffee cup. In the summer of 1858, they had it, or nearly had it. The final ratios needed testing, but the principles were sound and the results of their tests were extraordinary. Wood treated with their formula lasted 3-4 times as long in wet conditions. It was worth a great deal of money. More importantly to Isaiah, it was worth a great many lives. Lily looked at the rolled papers in her hands. Pike saw the value. Pike saw only the value. He had never once in 2 years seen anything else in that workshop. The craft, the problem solving, the relationship between a material and the person shaping it, none of that was real to him. It was all just inventory waiting to be monetized. Tom looked at his hands. On the night of September 13th, 1858, Isaiah was working late. He did this regularly. Michael had gone home earlier, and I had finished at the forge and gone to supper at what was then the only dining establishment in Silverwood. Pike should have been gone by afternoon, but I saw him from across the street going back into the workshop after dark. I thought nothing of it. People forgot things. People went back. He was quiet for a moment. The next morning they found Isaiah. The support beam in the upper section of the workshop, the one that held the drying lumber overhead, it had come down. The official account was that it had been weakened by a crack that hadn't been noticed, that it had finally given under the weight that Isaiah had been working underneath it when it fell. He looked at her directly. That beam had been sound the week before. I had looked at it myself because Isaiah had asked me about reinforcing the connection plate standard maintenance. It was sound, and the angle of the fall, the way the timber came down, was not consistent with a structural failure. It was consistent with someone cutting into the connection. Yes, the word dropped into the quiet of the forge like a stone into still water. The formula was gone, Tom continued. The pages with the final ratios. Gone from the workshop, gone from Isaiah's private papers, gone as completely as if they had never existed. Michael came to me 2 days later in a state I had never seen him in before and have never forgotten. He was frightened in the way a man was frightened when he understood clearly what someone was capable of. He said Pike had seen him the previous evening, had seen Michael near the workshop, and that when their eyes met on the street the next morning, Pike had smiled in a way that communicated everything without words. He was telling Michael what he'd done. He was telling Michael what he'd done and what would happen if Michael said anything about it. Lily thought about her father as she knew him. A quiet man, precise with his hands, patient with difficult materials, careful about the promises he made. A man who had taught her that good work did not care whose hands made it. A man who had apparently carried a specific terror inside himself for the rest of his life and died without telling anyone what it was. He told you he was leaving. He came to say goodbye. He said he was going back to Philadelphia, that he had family there, that he was going to change his name and start over somewhere Pike couldn't find him. He said to tell Jonah he was sorry. Tom's voice had gone quieter. He said to make sure Jonah was all right. And then he left. And then he left. Tom looked at her steadily, or he tried to. The lamp between them threw warm shadows across the forge walls. Outside, Silverwood had gone quiet with the particular quality of a mountain town after dark, the daytime noise absorbed by the coming cold, the streets emptying toward warmth and lamplight. You never heard from him, Lily said. Not once. In 30 years. Not once. You wrote to Philadelphia. Twice. The first time no one answered. The second time a man wrote back saying no Michael Brennan had lived in that neighborhood in the years in question. A pause. I told myself he must have changed his name as he'd planned, that the man who answered didn't know him by that name. I told myself that because the alternative was a conclusion I had no way to verify and nothing to do with. Lily set down her coffee cup. She looked at the rolled papers in her hands. She thought about what it meant that a girl in Philadelphia had grown up calling a man father, a man who knew Isaiah Stone's business well enough to step into a dead partner's shoes, who knew Michael Brennan's trade well enough to teach it to a daughter who had never spoken about Colorado, who had kept himself careful and quiet and close. She thought about what it meant that she was here, now, in this town, at this particular moment. Tom, she said carefully, the man I called father. He was a good man. He was patient and skilled, and he taught me everything I know about wood and grain and the way a material has a memory of what it used to be. She paused. But there were things he never talked about. Places in his history that had no content, just silence where the content should have been. I thought grief. I thought privacy. I thought some men kept their histories to themselves, and that was their right. Tom was very still. Was he the right age, she asked? The man I grew up with? Was he the right age to have been here in 1858? How old was he when he died? He told us 61. Tom looked at the wall of the forge for a long moment. Michael Brennan was 47 when he left here, he said. He would have been 61 about 2 years ago, yes. The two of them sat with that. There could be an explanation, Lily said, and she was not sure whether she was offering it to Tom or to herself. There could be a connection I'm missing. It could be coincidence, we suppose. Yes, Tom said. He did not sound as if he believed it was coincidence. He did not sound as if she believed it either. What happened to Pike? She asked after a moment. After 1858. He disappeared for a year. Then he came back with money, bought property, bought influence, started lending to the businesses that were struggling, which gave him relationships and leverage. 15 years ago, he ran for town council and won. He is now, by the accounting of most people in this town who don't look too closely, a respectable pillar of the community. Tom's voice was controlled and flat in the way that controlled flatness covered something that had nowhere to go. He partnered with Vincent Kane about 10 years ago. Kane's mill uses a waterproofing treatment that Kane has registered under the name Kane Industries Proprietary Formula. The treatment is sold at 3 times the market rate for standard timber sealant. It is extremely effective, more effective than anything else available. He looked at her. I have been using it on ironwork settings for outdoor installation. It is more effective than anything else available by exactly the margin that Isaiah and Michael's formula would have been more effective, exactly. Lily thought about the torn edge of the formula page, the clean, deliberate cut. She thought about the biennial contract she had seen mentioned in a merchant's window on the main street when she walked past the county bridge maintenance contract awarded annually to Kane Industries at a rate that represented the most expensive line item in the territorial infrastructure budget. She thought about Walter Murphy and a falling log. She thought about Isaiah Stone and a falling beam. She thought about all the years that Gerald Pike had sat on the town council of Silverwood, presiding over meetings, shaking hands at church, watching Jonah Stone's business, and knowing what had been taken from it, knowing that the foundation of every bridge contract and every weather-treated building in the county rested on a formula that he had bought with the man's life. I need to talk to Jonah, she said. I thought you might. He doesn't know about the formula, about Pike. He knows his father died. He knows the workshop nearly failed after Isaiah was gone, and that he rebuilt it through a decade of the hardest possible work. He knows Kane wants his land and won't say why. Tom looked at her steadily. He does not know that his father's murderer has been sitting on the town council for 15 years, using Isaiah Stone's work to get rich. Number one, I was never able to find a way to tell him that he could act on. And now, Tom said, you've arrived with your father's name in your father's hands and 30 years of a story that has been waiting for someone to be brave enough to finish it. He reached across the workbench and picked up a small receipt from a stack of papers she had not noticed, held it out to her. She took it. It was from Kane Lumber, dated 6 months prior. Payment confirmation for treated timber delivered to the County Road Commission. In the line that read Formula Certification, the text read, Waterproof treatment per Kane Industries Proprietary Formula, exclusively licensed. Below that, barely visible, but they're originally developed in partnership with Kane Pike Holdings, established 1859. Pike, named on the document, 1 year after Isaiah Stone died. This is evidence, Lily said. It's a thread, Tom said. Pull carefully. She walked back to Murphy's rooms in the dark with the rolled plans under one arm and the receipt in her coat pocket, and she was still walking through implications when she heard the footsteps behind her. Quick, purposeful, not the casual pace of someone heading home. Her hand went to the small knife Kate had given her that morning, finding it in her coat pocket by touch the blade folded flat. She did not quicken her pace. She did not look back. She cataloged the distance to the next lit doorway, the next intersection, the boarding house still 3 buildings ahead. Miss Brennan, the voice was smooth and unhurried, the voice of a man who had never in his life needed to raise it to be heard. Working late, I see. A dedicated worker. She stopped. She turned around. Vincent Kane stood in the middle of the street behind her hatless, his expensive suit making him look like a detail from a different picture, something from a city dropped into the wrong landscape. He was smiling the smile that did not connect to his eyes. I don't have anything to say to you, she said. Then listen. He moved closer with the unhurried confidence of a man who did not expect to be stopped. I made you an offer last night that you declined publicly, which was your right and which I don't hold against you. I make the offer again, now privately, without witnesses, so there's no performance required from either of us. He paused. $10 a week, a house of your own, work that does not involve carrying plates and peeling potatoes. All that's required is that you maintain your position at Stone's workshop and provide me with information about his business, his finances, and his intentions regarding the land along Silver Creek. You want me to spy on him. I want you to be practical. I told you last night what I thought of your practicality. Kane's expression did not change in any significant way, but something shifted behind it. Something that was the opposite of the surface warmth. Something patient and cold and accustomed to waiting. Winter in the high country is a different proposition from wintering in Philadelphia, he said. You don't have family here. You don't have connections. You have a temporary arrangement with a boarding house owner who has her own precarious relationship with the commercial interests of this town, and you've made an enemy of me in public on your first day. He tilted his head. That's not a strong position. No, Lily agreed, it's not. So reconsider. The answer is the same as last night. He studied her for a moment with the focused attention of someone solving a problem. You've been to see Tom Fletcher, he said. She did not react. Tom is an old man with a long memory and a grievance he's never been able to act on. Kane continued. Whatever he's told you, whatever papers he might have given you, I'd be careful about what you do with them. Information is only useful if the person holding it can survive long enough to use it. He was not threatening her. His voice was still perfectly conversational, still perfectly pleasant. That was the point. Think carefully, Miss Brennan. You've come a very long way. It would be unfortunate to have traveled all this way for nothing. He walked past her toward the saloon at the west end of the street. Lily stood in the dark for a moment, watching him go. Then she turned and walked the remaining distance to Murphy's rooms, pushed through the front door, went directly to the kitchen, and found Kate at the table with a cup of tea and the expression of someone who had been waiting up. She put the rolled plans and the receipt on the table. She sat down. She told Kate everything Tom had told her precisely and in order because precision was the only way to treat information this important. When she finished, Kate was quiet for a long moment. Then Kate said, Jonah needs to know. Yes. He won't want to hear it. No. He'll resist it because accepting it means accepting that his father's death was something other than the accident he was told it was, and that Gerald Pike has been eating dinner 20 feet from him at town functions for 15 years. Kate wrapped her hands around her teacup. And then he'll want to do something about it. Yes, and doing something about it is dangerous. Yes, Lily said, but not doing something about it is also dangerous. Kane just told me as much without saying it directly. She looked at Kate. He knows Tom talked to me. He knows I have something. He's warning me because he thinks the warning will work. Will it? Lily thought about her father's plans on the table in Tom Fletcher's forge. 2 sets of handwriting working the same problem from different angles. 30 years of a theft that had been treated as a tragedy. An old man keeping a rolled tube of papers against the day someone would arrive who could do something with them. She thought about Jonah Stone setting a handplane down with careful precision before he turned to face her. No, she said, it won't work. Kate looked at her for a long time. The town council hearing is 5 days away, Kate said. If Kane gets the inspection he's requested, and he will get it because he has 3 council members who owe him money, they'll find violations. Real ones or manufactured ones, it doesn't matter. Jonah will have to close the workshop for repairs he can't afford. He'll lose his commission pipeline. He'll lose the lease on his timber supply because Kane controls the mill that supplies him. And once he's lost enough, he'll sell the land because he'll have no other choice. Unless we stop it. Unless you stop it, Kate said. I've been watching this happen for 5 years since Walter died, and I have not found a way to stop it. I don't have what Tom has. I don't have what you now have. She nodded at the rolled plans on the table. But having it and using it are different problems. Pike controls the local law. The sheriff has been in his pocket for a decade. Anything you try to do through official channels here will be redirected before it gets anywhere. Then we need to go outside official channels here, Lily said. We need to go to someone who doesn't fall inside Pike's reach. The federal marshal's office in Denver. Yes, Denver is 3 days by stagecoach. I know. Kate looked at the plans, at the receipt, at Lily. You'll need Jonah, she said. For the evidence to mean anything, you'll need the son of Isaiah Stone standing beside it. His testimony about his father's death combined with Tom's account and these documents. That's a case. Alone, it's one woman's claim about events she wasn't present for. I know that too. He won't want to leave the workshop. Tommy is here, the commission work is here, everything he's been protecting is here. I know. Kate was quiet for another moment. Talk to him tomorrow, she said finally. Morning before Tommy is up. He's usually in the workshop by 5. He'll tell you it's not your problem and you should leave it alone. She stood picking up her teacup. Tell him everything anyway. Let him tell you it's not your problem. Then tell him again. Lily rolled the plans back up, folded the receipt into her pocket. Kate, she said, the man I grew up with. My father or the man I called father. Is it possible that he was someone else? Someone who knew Michael Brennan and took his place? Someone who came east with Michael's name and Michael's tools and Michael's knowledge of the trade? Kate sat back down. Is that what you're thinking? It's what the evidence suggests if Michael Brennan never arrived in Philadelphia, and if the man I grew up with couldn't account for the years before he did arrive. She looked at the table. It would mean my father, the real one, never made it out of Colorado. It would mean he died here, somewhere alone, and no one knew. Kate was quiet for a long time. I don't know, she said finally. I don't know what happened to Michael Brennan. Tom doesn't know for certain either, or he would have told you. She paused. But I know that if it's true, then you have more reason to be here than anyone in this town understands. And I know that whatever you find out, whatever the answer to that question turns out to be, the man who raised you and taught you and put those tools in your hands did something that mattered, whatever he was. Lily looked at the rolled plans under her arm. He taught me to read the grain, she said quietly. He said the wood has a memory, that it remembers what it used to be. She went upstairs. She lay on the narrow bed in the attic room and held Clara's coat in the dark, and she listened to the mountains being quiet outside the window, and she thought about what was in the mined-out hills east of town, where a man named Michael Brennan had supposedly once walked and never arrived where he was going. She thought about what was in Pike's private office. She thought about 5 days. She thought about the grain of a piece of wood and the way, if you looked carefully enough, it told you the whole story of where it had been. At some point, without noticing the transition, she was asleep. She was at the workshop by 5 the next morning. The town was still dark, the sky above the mountains holding the particular deep blue that existed in the hour before dawn, committed to anything when the night had not quite finished and the day had not quite begun. Her breath came out in small clouds. The forge was cold at Tom's end of the street. The boarding house behind her was quiet except for Kate's earliest movements in the kitchen, the sound of a fire being coaxed into morning. The workshop doors were closed but not latched, and light came through the gap between them in the thin gold line of a lantern burning inside. Lily pushed through. Jonah was at the bench nearest the eastern window, not working, but standing over a set of drawings with a carpenter's pencil behind his ear and both hands flat on the paper, looking at something in the plans with the concentrated stillness of a man trying to find an answer in a question he already knew was wrong. He looked up when she came in. He did not look surprised to see her, which told her that on some level he had been expecting. This conversation had perhaps been expecting it since the previous afternoon when he had watched without appearing to watch while she sat with his nephew and turned the primer's arbitrary symbols into sounds. Tommy's not up yet, he said. I know, I'm not here about Tommy. He straightened, took the pencil from behind his ear, and set it down on the drawings with the deliberate care of a man setting one thing aside to pick up another. He looked at her with the stone-gray eyes that had over the past 2 days shown her more of their interior than he probably knew. She told him everything. She told it the way Tom had told her, in order without embellishment or editorializing, because the facts were sufficient on their own, and because she had learned from years of being in situations where she needed to be believed that the best argument was precision. She told him about the partnership, about the formula, and the torn page about the night of September 13th, 1858, and what Tom had seen from across the street. She told him about Michael Brennan's fear and his departure, about the 30 years of silence that followed. She put the rolled plans on the workbench and unrolled them, weighted the corners, pointed to the two sets of handwriting, showed him the torn edge. She put the receipt beside the plans. She watched his face. His expression did not change in the ways that expressions usually changed when people received difficult information. There was no shock because the shock had been absorbed somewhere earlier in some part of him that had always known that the official account of his father's death had not added up. What moved across his face instead was something older and more complex, the particular quality of a grief that has been waiting a long time to be confirmed, that has been living inside the body as a formless weight and is now finally being given its proper shape. His hands had gone still on the edge of the workbench. "Pike," he said. It was not a question. Tom believed so. The timeline, the document, the 30 years of profit from a formula that should have been your father's. She paused. Tom has never had anything solid enough to act on. But this receipt names Pike directly in the ownership of the formula. Combined with Tom's eyewitness account of seeing Pike at the workshop that night, combined with your testimony about the circumstances of your father's death, it's a case. Jonah looked at the receipt, at the formula annotations in the margin of the plans, at his father's handwriting, which was his own handwriting's ancestor, the same particular way of forming the numeral 7, the same slight lean in the capital letters. "He's been in this town the whole time," Jonah said, "at the council meetings, at the church supper. He came to my father's funeral." He said it with the particular stillness of a man who has just watched a weight he has been carrying for years finally reveal its true shape. It was the flatness of someone who was keeping a very large feeling in a very small room while they decided what to do with it. "I know. 30 years, yes." He turned away from the workbench and walked to the window, stood looking out at the dark street with his back to her, and she let him stand there because some things needed a moment between the knowing and the deciding. When he turned back, something had been added to his stillness, not warmth, not yet, but direction. "Tom talks too much," he said, and there was something in his voice that was almost in a controlled and painful way, almost something like gratitude toward the old man who had kept the rolled tube of papers for 30 years, waiting for the right person to arrive. "Tom talks exactly enough," Lily said, a breath that might in other circumstances have been a laugh. "What are you proposing?" he asked. "Pike keeps important documents in his private office, the town hall second floor. If the journal Tom described exists, if Pike was arrogant enough to write down what he did, it will be there, Russ. If the original formula documentation exists, it will be there. We need to get it. And we need to get it in the next 4 days before the council hearing gives Kane the leverage to close this workshop." "You're describing breaking into the town hall." "I am. Pike has the sheriff." "I know. If we're caught, we go to jail. In a town where the law serves the man we're trying to expose." "I know that too." He looked at her steadily. "You understand that this is not your problem. You arrived here 3 days ago. None of this belongs to you." She thought about the rolled plans on the workbench and her father's handwriting in the margins. She thought about Michael Brennan's 30 years of silence that might have been 30 years of fear. She thought about what Tom had not said directly, but had made clear enough that Michael Brennan might never have left Colorado, might be somewhere in this county, not in Philadelphia at all, and that the man who had raised her and taught her and died quietly in a rented room on a Philadelphia street might have been someone else entirely, someone who had found a dead man's name useful. "My father's name is in those margins," she said. "His work is in that formula. Whatever happened to him, whoever he really was, this started with him." She held Jonah's gaze. "It belongs to me." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "We don't do this without a plan." "I know. And we don't do it tonight. We do it tomorrow night after I've walked the exterior and confirmed the access point you're describing. The window on the second floor. It's warped on the left side. The latch doesn't seat properly." "How do you know that?" "I delivered linens to Doc Cross on the second floor of the building next door yesterday morning. The windows face each other across a 4-foot gap. I looked." He studied her with an expression that she could not entirely read, but that had something in it that was not entirely professional. Something that was possibly beginning to be something else. "All right," he said. The day that followed moved in the way that days moved when the surface activity and the underlying activity had nothing to do with each other. On the surface, Lily organized the stain cabinet by type and age, cross-referenced the tool inventory against a list she had made the previous afternoon, and spent 3 hours with Tommy in the afternoon working through the reading primer and a new set of arithmetic problems involving the measurement of lumber length, which Tommy found considerably more tractable than abstract numbers because they connected to something he could see and touch. Below the surface, she'd moved through the plan, continuously testing it from different angles, finding the points of weakness and the points where the weakness could be managed. Kate was in that plan necessarily. She had the clearest view of the town's rhythms, knew when the night watchman made his rounds, knew which of the town hall windows faced streets and which faced the alley behind the building. She brought this information to Lily over the supper cleanup with the quiet precision of a woman who had been waiting for an opportunity to do something other than survive. Jonah came to the boarding house after Tommy was asleep, and the three of them sat at Kate's kitchen table with the lamp turned low and the window shuttered, and they made a plan the way people made plans when the stakes were real, slowly from the beginning, assuming nothing. The night watchman made his rounds at 9 and again at midnight and again at 3 in the morning. The back window of Pike's second-floor office faced the alley, which was unlit, and backed against the lumber storage yard of a merchant who closed at 5. The external staircase on the north side of the town hall was original construction, 22 years old wood that had been exposed to altitude weather without adequate maintenance. "It'll make noise," Lily said. "How much noise?" "Enough to hear in the alley, not enough to hear from the street if the wind is from the west, which it usually is at night this time of year." "I'll be at the base of the stairs," Jonah said. "If anything moves on the street, I can see it from there." "And I'll be at the alley entrance," Kate said. She placed a small handbell on the table. "1 ring means someone's coming, 2 means they're close, 3 means run." Jonah looked at the handbell. "You've thought about this before." "I've thought about it every day since Walter died," Kate said simply. "I just didn't have the right pieces until now." "Tomorrow night, after the watchman's 9 o'clock round and before his midnight round. 2 hours." Lily went to bed that night and did not sleep for a long time, lying in the dark, listening to the mountains and running the plan through its paces one more time, and then one more time after that, not from anxiety, but from the particular discipline of someone who understood that the difference between a plan that worked and a plan that didn't was usually in the detail that had been passed over because it seemed minor. She thought about the warped window latch, the creak of old staircase timber, the distance from the office to the window, the weight of what she was looking for and how much of it she could carry inside her clothing. She thought about her father's tool roll in the carpet bag beside the bed, and she thought about the awl she had used on the stagecoach driver, and she thought about the small knife Kate had given her on her first morning, which she had been carrying since then in the fold of her coat. She thought about Tommy asking if someone had hit her. She thought about Jonah's hands going still on the workbench when she said the word murder. At some point she was asleep, and then it was the next morning, and then it was the afternoon, and then Tommy was working through the primer with the focused determination of someone who had decided that reading was a problem he intended to solve rather than avoid, and then the afternoon was over, and supper was over, and the boarders were in their rooms, and the town was quiet, and it was time. The night came in cold and clear. Stars above the mountains in the quantity that only existed at altitude the Milky Way, visible as an actual river of light rather than a theoretical concept. The kind of sky that made a person feel both small and paradoxically located, as if the vastness of it placed you rather than erased you. The three of them moved through the back streets of Silverwood, in dark clothing, staying in the deepest shadows, making no unnecessary sound. Kate to the alley entrance, taking up her position with the practiced stillness of someone who had been waiting for this particular night for 5 years. Jonah to the base of the external staircase where the north wall of the town hall met the alley, his back to the stone, his eyes on the street beyond. Lily at the foot of the stairs. She looked up. 22 years of mountain weather had taken the staircase from functional to something that needed to be negotiated rather than simply climbed. She could see in the moonlight where the handrail had separated from its post on the third step, where the fourth and fifth treads had developed the slight bow that meant the nails were working loose from the stringer beneath, where the upper landing had a soft spot from water damage that would compress audibly under weight. She thought about the sound a staircase made when it was frightened, and the sound it made when it was simply old, and she knew the difference. Her father had taught her the difference. She put her foot on the first step at the outer edge, where the tread met the stringer, where the wood was structurally supported rather than spanning free. She moved her weight onto it gradually, the way her father had taught her to test old structures, feeling for the response before committing. The tread shifted slightly, a minor flexing, but did not speak. Step by step, an outer edge, gradual weight transfer, reading the response of each board before asking the next thing of it. She was at the landing in 90 seconds. The window was exactly where she had observed it from Doc Cross's building. The left side of the frame had the warped gap. She had seen the latch handle seated 2 inches above the keeper plate because the frame had expanded unevenly over years of altitude seasons. She took the small knife from her coat, folded it to expose the back of the blade, worked it into the gap with the careful, deliberate motion of someone fitting a joint, and felt for the latch arm on the interior side. A minute of delicate work. Then a soft click. The window swung inward. The smell of Pike's office came through the opening first. Cigar smoke, old paper, the particular odor of a room that was kept closed and warm, that contained the accumulated residue of years of occupancy by a man who believed his private space was inviolable. She climbed through. The room resolved itself in the moonlight coming through the window she had just entered, enough to see shapes and surfaces but not details. She waited 10 seconds for her eyes to calibrate. A large desk dominating the center. Filing cabinets along the left wall. A safe in the corner, small and solid. A bookcase. On the desk, neat stacks of documents with the organization of a man who managed information carefully, because information was how he managed everything else. She started with the desk. The first drawer held correspondence, business letters, council minutes, invoices, the ordinary paperweight of a man who occupied an official position. Nothing. The second drawer held personal items, a flask, a box of cigars, a leather-bound journal. She picked up the journal, moved to the window, tilted it to catch the moonlight. The entries were brief, dated, businesslike. Recent entries discussed the council hearing, the timber contract renewal, a correspondence with a railroad surveying company she did not recognize. She turned backward through the pages deeper into the past, and the entries changed, became longer, took on a different quality, less administrative, more interior. The writing of a man who used his journal not to record what had happened, but to argue with himself about what he had done. She turned back further. The handwriting changed character again. Somewhere in the middle of the book became tighter, more controlled, the handwriting of a younger man writing under a kind of pressure. She found the year 1858 in the upper right corner of a page, June 15th, 1858. Stone treats me as a laborer. He and Brennan speak of the formula as if I am not present, as if I have not contributed equally to every step of its development. They will patent it in their names alone, and I will receive a day rate for my trouble. A day rate. I have given 2 years to this. I have given more than they know. She turned pages. August 3rd, 1858. The final ratios are complete. Stone has them in his private papers. Brennan knows the numbers but has not written them down, his habit, with everything the man thinks and would, and keeps it all in his hands. The formula is extraordinary. What Stone is planning to do with it, give it to the County Road Commission at cost as a gift to public safety, is the most extravagant waste of a fortune I have ever witnessed. A man who would give away a fortune does not deserve to keep it. She turned pages. September 12th, 1858. Tomorrow night. Stone works late on Thursdays, the others gone by 5. The support connection on the upper beam is already weakened from the modifications I made last month. A single cut in the right place, and the weight of the drying lumber above will do the rest. I have the ratios. I took them from his private papers this afternoon while he was at the assayer's office. He will not have time to notice before tomorrow. She turned one more page. September 14th, 1858. It is done. Stone is dead. The formula is in my possession. Brennan saw me leaving the workshop last evening, and his face told me that he understood. He will say nothing. He is a careful man and a frightened one, and he has nothing to gain by speaking and everything to lose. By next week, he will be gone. In a year, I will return. I will have enough capital to purchase property and begin properly. No one will question the origins. They never do when a man arrives with money enough to be respectable. Lily stood at the window with the journal in her hands, in the moonlight on the page, and she read it twice to make certain she had read it correctly. And then she folded these pages, the 3 September entries and the August one. that demonstrated premeditation, folded them along their existing creases and placed them inside her dress against her skin. She went to the filing cabinets. The first cabinet held property records, deed transfers, the accumulated land acquisitions of 30 years of leveraged wealth. The second held financial records, contracts, the paperwork, infrastructure of Kane Pike Holdings. She moved through the third cabinet, then the fourth. Nothing. She stood in the middle of the room and thought about where a man kept the thing he could not destroy but could not safely display. The safe. Too obvious, too heavy, no way to open it. The bookcase. She moved to it, running her fingers along the shelves in the dark, feeling the spines feeling behind the rows of books for anything that should not be there. The third shelf from the bottom in the back left corner, where the bookcase met the wall, her fingers found a surface that did not match the wall behind it. A panel. The kind of panel that was fitted into a wall recess rather than attached to it, that could be lifted clear rather than swung. She worked her fingers into the edge and lifted. Behind the panel, a recess approximately the size of a document box. Inside the recess, a leather portfolio flat tied with a cord that had been untied and retied many times. She untied it. Inside the portfolio, preserved with the care of a man who understood their value, even while he could not display them, were papers. Handwritten in two distinct scripts, the same two scripts she had seen on Tom Fletcher's architectural plans. The formula pages, complete. The full mixture ratios in Isaiah Stone's careful hand, the modification notes in Michael Brennan's printing the testing records that documented what they had achieved and how. Taken 30 years ago from a dead man's workshop. At the bottom of the portfolio, beneath the formula pages, lay a small brass locket. She closed her hand around it without looking at it. There would be time for that later. She placed the portfolio inside her dress with the journal pages, retied the cord, replaced the leather covering, put the panel back. She moved back to the window. She was reaching for the sill when she heard the footsteps. They were in the hallway. Not the street, not the building's exterior, but inside, on the other side of the office door, already close. Heavy and deliberate, accompanied by the distinct sound of a key being turned in a lock, that was, she now realized, the lock on this door. Her heart stopped. The window was 8 feet behind her. The door was opening. She dropped to the floor and rolled under the desk in a single movement, pulling herself into the space between the desk's rear panel and the wall, drawing her knees to her chest, pressing herself flat. Going still in the way, an animal went still when stillness was the only option. The door swung open. Lamplight flooded the room. 2 sets of footsteps entered. Vincent Kane's voice. Someone was in here. The window was latched when I left this afternoon. I latched it myself. Gerald Pike's voice, older, rougher, the voice of a man in his late 60s who had spent decades being careful. You're being paranoid, Vincent. Who would dare come in here? The Brennan woman. Kane moved through the room. Lily could see his boots through the narrow gap between the floor and the desk's lower panel. Good leather, expensive, moving with the precise, deliberate pace of someone conducting a search. She's been at Tom Fletcher's forge. She's been spending time at Stone's workshop. She and Stone have been talking more than the tutoring arrangement requires. She's nothing. Pike's voice was dismissive, the dismissiveness of a man who had spent so long being unquestioned that he had stopped believing in challenges. A mail-order bride who didn't get married, she'll leave as soon as she has enough money to go somewhere else. She won't. Kane was at the filing cabinets now. Lily heard a drawer slide open. I offered her $10 a week to work for me. She refused. A woman with 11 cents refused $10 a week. A pause. Women who do that have something they believe is worth more than $10 a week. They're the dangerous kind. Pike moved to the desk. Lily felt the vibration of his hand touching the surface 2 feet above her head, heard papers shifting. Even if she found something, Pike said, who would she tell? The sheriff? I appointed the sheriff. The council? I am the council. A sound that was not quite a laugh. We have been doing this for 30 years, Vincent. We are not threatened by a woman who arrived 3 days ago with no money and no connections. She has Stone. Stone is a carpenter who refuses to sell his land. He is not a threat, he is an inconvenience, and the council hearing on Friday will resolve that inconvenience permanently. Kane had finished with the filing cabinets. He was moving toward the bookcase. Lily did not breathe. His hand on the bookshelf spines. Moving along the second shelf, the third shelf. His hand passed the section of the third shelf where the panel was, moved past it, stopped, went back. She felt the pause in her entire body. Then Pike said, "Come away from there. I check my valuables every morning. Everything is where it should be. You are wasting time on a woman who will be gone within the week." A pause. Kane stepped back from the bookcase. "I want her gone before the hearing," he said. "Her reputation needs to be damaged. I've already begun the conversation. By tomorrow night, every merchant in this town will have heard that her arrangement at Stone's workshop is not professional." "That kind of talk is unpleasant but effective," Pike agreed, "and give it 2 days. And if she persists after that." Pike's voice was entirely without inflection. "Accidents happen in mountain towns. Women traveling alone can disappear without much attention." "Not yet. If she disappears now, Stone will connect it to us. Let the hearing happen first. Let him lose the workshop. Once he's broken, her testimony about anything becomes the testimony of a woman attached to a failed man." No one listens. They stood in the office for another few minutes, Kane conducting a final visual survey of the room, Pike standing near the desk with the patience of a man who had managed secrets for 30 years and was not undone by one more evening of managing them. Then they left. The lamp went with them. The door closed, the lock engaged, darkness. Lily counted to 100 in the silence, her heart making itself known in her chest, her back against the wall, the portfolio and the journal pages pressed against her skin. Then she uncurled from under the desk. She moved to the window, looked out. The alley was empty, both of them having exited through the building's front. She climbed through the window. She descended the stairs with less caution than she had climbed them, because speed mattered now more than silence. Jonah materialized from the shadow at the base of the stairs. He had heard them enter the building. He had stood at the base of those stairs for 20 minutes, not knowing if she was under arrest or worse, and whatever that had cost him was visible in his face in the moonlight, in the controlled relief of a man who had been managing a very specific fear and was now releasing it. She took his hand when she reached the ground, and she did not let go immediately, and he did not pull away. "I have it," she said. "All of it." Kate was already moving toward them from the alley entrance. They walked quickly through the dark streets, staying off the main street, threading through the back lanes that Kate knew by long familiarity. To the boarding house, up the stairs to Kate's private sitting room at the back of the second floor, where the shuttered windows faced the mountain rather than the street. Lily spread the journal pages on the table. She spread the formula portfolio. Jonah looked at his father's handwriting in the lamp's warm circle, and he looked at it for a long time without speaking, and whatever was happening in his face during that time was his alone. Then he looked up. "Denver," he said. "Yes. The stage takes 3 days. We don't take the stage. Kane will know by morning that the office was accessed. He'll have people watching the stage stop by noon." The mountain trail. He was already thinking through it. She could see him doing it, the same focused, practical planning that he applied to a complicated commission, working backwards from the required outcome through the necessary steps. "It's faster than the stage if the passes are clear. 2 days if we ride hard. It's 2 days if nothing goes wrong," Kate said quietly. "Can you manage Tommy?" Lily asked her. "He can stay here. I'll tell him you had business in Denver, that you'll be back." Kate looked between them. "What I'm concerned about is Kane's men on the trail. He has people. He's used them before. If he knows we've taken something from Pike's office, he'll send riders." Jonah was standing now, already mapping the route in his mind. "There's a secondary trail that branches off the main pass road 12 miles east of town, goes through the old mining country, comes out above the South Platte. Fewer people know it exists. And if you're caught in the high country, then we're caught in the high country," Lily said, "which is better than being caught here in a town where the sheriff takes orders from the man we're trying to expose." Kate did not answer immediately. She stood up from the table, and when she came back from the kitchen, she was carrying a canvas sack that she set on the table with a solidity that suggested it had been thought about before tonight. Inside, dried venison and hard bread and a block of cheese, a folded blanket, ammunition, a small pistol that was old but well maintained. "My husband's," Kate said. "I've kept it clean." Lily picked it up, checked it the way her father had taught her, because her father had believed that a woman alone needed to know how tools worked, all tools, and a firearm was a tool. Loaded correctly, hammer sound. Before dawn, Jonah said. Tom has horses. I'll go now. He knows, Lily asked. He will in 5 minutes. Jonah moved toward the door, then stopped and turned back. And there was something in his face that had not been there before, something that had been moved out of storage and placed where it could be seen. What you did tonight, going in there alone knowing what you knew about what he was willing to do. He paused. That took more courage than most men I've known. I wasn't brave, Lily said, and she meant it. I was too angry to be afraid. Something moved in his expression that might in more time and better circumstances have become a smile. Then he was out the door and moving through the dark toward the forge. She went to her attic room. She packed her carpet bag with everything that mattered, which did not take long because everything that mattered fit in a small space: the tool roll, Clara's coat, the linens she had arrived with the plans Tom had given her, and that now lived alongside the retrieved formula in the portfolio. She was ready in 10 minutes. She sat on the edge of the bed and held Clara's coat for a moment, not to grieve but to carry the weight of it deliberately, because there were some things you did not leave behind, even when leaving was necessary. She thought about Tommy asleep in the workshop's back room. She thought about what it meant to leave a child who had already been left by everyone, even temporarily, even necessarily. She thought about what Jonah had said about Anna and Ruth, the drowning quality of that grief, the year of just trying to remember how to breathe. She thought about the journal pages against her skin, Pike's handwriting, confessing to things he had been confident enough in his own invulnerability to write down. The arrogance of a man who believed that power made things permanent. She thought about the formula pages in her father's printing and Isaiah Stone's careful notation, 2 men's years of patient work preserved in a leather portfolio behind a wall panel, because even Pike, for all his arrogance, had understood that what they had made was worth keeping. She went downstairs. Kate was in the kitchen awake making coffee that she pressed into Lily's hands with the practical directness of someone who understood that sentiment was best expressed through action. Whatever you find out there, Kate said, about your father, about who he was or wasn't. She paused. The man who raised you taught you to do what you did tonight, to move carefully through a room in the dark, to read a structure before you trust your weight to it, to know the difference between a latch that holds and one that only appears to. She looked at Lily over the rim of her own cup. Whatever he was, he gave you tools that worked when you needed them. That's not nothing. Lily thought about her father's hands guiding hers on the chisel, about his voice saying, "Move with the grain, not against it," about the 30 years of silence that she now understood was a man living inside a story that was not entirely his own. "No," she said, "it's not nothing." Jonah arrived at the back door 40 minutes before dawn, with 2 horses from Tom's stable, saddled and provisioned, their breath making small clouds in the cold pre-dawn air. Tom had come with him, and the old man stood in Kate's kitchen doorway with the particular expression of someone who had done everything they could and was now required to let other people carry it forward. The formula pages, he said to Lily, keep them separate from the journal entries. If you lose one set, the other still has value. She had already done this. The formula in the portfolio in the carpet bag, the journal pages in the inner pocket of her coat directly against her skin. "If you reach Wilson," Tom said, and she noticed he said, "if not when," because Tom Fletcher was a careful man who did not make promises the world might not keep. "Tell him there's a witness in Silverwood who will testify to seeing Pike at the workshop the night of the incident. Tell him the witness has been waiting 30 years for someone to ask." "I'll tell him." Tom Fletcher looked at her. He had the expression of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and was feeling the weight shift not gone but redistributed. "Your father," he said and stopped. "You don't know," she said gently. "No, I don't know." "Then I'll find out." She meant it the way she had meant every promise she had made since arriving in Silverwood, which was the only way she knew how to mean things. She went to the workshop before they left. Tommy's room was off the back of the main workshop, a small space with a low ceiling and a window that faced east toward the mountains. She opened the door quietly. In the gray pre-dawn light, she could see the shape of him in the narrow bed, the dark hair, the one arm thrown out over the blanket, in the abandoned posture of a child in deep sleep. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she moved to the workbench just inside the workshop proper and picked up a piece of scrap pine from the offcut box, a smooth fragment about the size of her hand, and the carpenter's pencil she found on the edge of the bench. She wrote on the wood because paper felt insufficient, and she was a carpenter's daughter or someone's daughter, and wood was what she trusted. Back soon. Still here. Keep practicing. She set it on Tommy's desk beside his school slate. Outside, Jonah was already mounted, holding her horse's reins, watching the eastern sky where the first gray of dawn was beginning to separate from the black. She took the reins, settled into the saddle, and looked back once at the workshop with its double doors closed, at the boarding house with Kate's lamp still burning in the kitchen window, at the mountains that had been watching all of this from above with their permanent, indifferent beauty. "Ready?" Jonah asked. Yes. They rode east into the morning. The trail climbed steeply from the first mile, switchbacking up through pine forests where the air was cold enough to sting, and the trees stood close on either side, their lower branches brushing the horses' flanks. The town fell away below them, quickly shrinking into its collection of wooden buildings and false fronts, looking from altitude like something that had been placed there tentatively, still deciding whether to stay. They did not speak for the first 2 hours. The trail required attention, loose shale on the exposed sections, a creek crossing where the water was already running cold, with snowmelt from the high country, a section of dense forest where the trail had been interrupted by a fall of timber that they had to navigate around, picking their way through the undergrowth, with the horses reluctant and needing reassurance. But there was a quality to the silence between them that was different from the silence of the first days. It was not the silence of two strangers. It was the silence of people who had been through something together and did not need to narrate it. At midday, they stopped to rest the horses at a place where a granite outcropping provided wind shelter and a view back down the valley that showed them at a glance that the trail behind them was empty. No riders, not yet. They ate from the provisions Kate had packed, standing rather than sitting, watching the valley below, while the horses drank from a narrow runoff stream. "The secondary trail is 2 miles ahead," Jonah said. "There's a junction marked by a cairn that the miners built when the Aurora operation was running. Most people don't know it's a junction. They just see the cairn and think it's a trail marker." "How do you know about it?" "I sourced timber from the Aurora mill for 3 years before it closed. I've ridden both trails in all conditions." He looked at the valley. "My father sourced timber from the same mill. I found his records when I went through the workshop accounts after he died. Same suppliers, same routes." He paused. "I didn't think about what that meant until now." She looked at the valley too. From here, Silverwood was invisible behind a ridge, the mountains indifferent as they always were, carrying everything that had happened on their slopes with the same equanimity they carried snow in silence. "Jonah," she said, "what I told you this morning about my father, about the possibility that the man I grew up with was not Michael Brennan." He looked at her. "I need you to understand that I don't know what's true," she said. "Tom doesn't know. We have a gap in a set of circumstances that are consistent with a particular explanation, but they're not proof. I may get to Denver and deliver this evidence and go back to Philadelphia and never find out what happened to Michael Brennan. I may find out something that changes everything I thought I knew about my life." She paused. I needed to say that out loud to someone who would hear it. Jonah was quiet for a moment. "I spent 3 years after Anna and Ruth died," he said, going back over every decision I'd made in the month before it happened. Every time I chose a commission over a day at home. Every evening I worked late. Every morning I left before they were awake. He looked at the mountains. "I built a case against myself that was exactly as complete and exactly as unprovable as anything else. I knew what I believed had happened. I knew what I was responsible for. I just couldn't prove it to anyone else's standard." She looked at him. "I don't know if that helps," he said. "It does," she said, "because it means you understand what it is to carry something that might be true without being able to prove it's true." "Yes." They stood in the wind on the granite outcropping, two people at the hinge point of something, and then he said with the directness of a man who had decided to stop managing what he felt, "When this is over, when we have delivered this evidence and whatever justice there is to come has begun, I want to say something to you that I have not been in a position to say properly. That I am glad you came to Silverwood, that whatever Cain intended when he sent that letter, the result was something he did not intend at all." He looked at her directly. and that I have not felt since before Anna died what I have felt in the past 3 days. I do not know what to do with that yet, but I wanted you to know that it exists." She was quiet for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the particular weight of something honest being said without performance. "I know," she said. "I feel it too." The second night on the trail, they made camp above the tree line where the stars were immediate and enormous, and the cold was serious. They built a small fire from the dry wood Jonah had packed, ate the last of the venison, sat with their backs to the same boulder, with the shared blanket over both of them, because survival made pragmatists of people, and the temperature was dropping toward freezing. "My father used to bring me up here," Jonah said, looking into the fire. "Before everything. He'd point out the constellations and tell me the stories behind the names. He said the stars were proof that beauty survived in the darkest places." He was right. He was right about most things. He just didn't know how to protect himself from the one person who knew how to use that against him. He looked at the fire. An honest man is vulnerable to dishonest ones in ways that dishonest men are not vulnerable to each other. My father believed Pike was what he appeared to be. He couldn't have imagined what Pike was actually capable of because he wasn't capable of imagining it himself. "That's not a flaw," Lily said. "No, it's just costly." They were quiet for a while, the fire settling into coals, the mountains enormous and dark around them. "If the man who raised me wasn't Michael Brennan," Lily said into the fire, "then somewhere in Colorado there is a grave or a mine or a place in the mountains where my actual father stopped, where he ran out of road to." She paused. "He died trying to leave. He was trying to go back to a life he knew, and he didn't make it. And a stranger found him and took his name and took his tools and built a life in his place. And that life included me." "A man who found a dead stranger and chose to become him," Jonah said, "and then raised his child as if she were his own, taught her everything he knew." "Yes. What does that make him?" She thought about it for a long time, listening to the fire, watching the stars. "It makes him complicated," she said, "like everyone." She slept that night and dreamed of her father's workshop in Philadelphia, the oak smell of it, the winter light through the high windows. In the dream, he was showing her how to cut a dovetail joint, his hands over hers, guiding the saw through the precise angle, and he was saying something she could not hear over the sound of the saw's movement through the wood. She kept trying to hear it. The dream kept not letting her. She woke in the gray pre-dawn to Jonah already moving, already kicking dirt over the fire remnants, his attention on the trail below them. She was up in a moment, her hand finding the pistol Kate had given her. "Riders," he said quietly. She listened. Below them on the trail, the sound of hooves on rock, multiple horses moving at the push pace of people who were not enjoying the scenery. How many? 4, maybe 5. She looked at the landscape above them. The trail continued upward to the main pass. But to the right above and to the east, the secondary trail junction should be within half a mile. "The cairn," she said. "Can we reach it before they round the lower switchback?" He assessed the terrain with the speed of someone who knew it. "Yes, if we go now." They went now. Up the slope through loose shale and scrub pine, the horses laboring the cold air, burning in the lungs, the sound of the riders below growing, and then as they rounded a granite shoulder that cut the sight line, going muffled and ambiguous with distance. The cairn was where he had said it would be, a stack of flat stones at the point where a barely visible track branched from the main trail to the right. The secondary trail dropped immediately into a fold of the mountain that was invisible from the main path, threading between two rock faces and then opening into a sequence of high meadows that ran east and downslope toward the distant gleam of the South Platte. They took it. An hour later, from a high point above the main trail, they could see 5 riders on the switchbacks below, following the main pass route, moving away from them, moving in the wrong direction. Jonah looked at the riders. Then he looked at Lily. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed saying. They turned their horses east and rode toward Denver. It was late the following afternoon when the city appeared below them, the South Platte reflecting the autumn light. The streets and brick buildings of the territorial capital spreading across the valley floor with the particular confident density of a place that had decided it was permanent. After 3 days of mountain trail, the sight of it had the quality of something from a different world, ordered and intentional and crowded in a way that felt almost aggressive after the vast quiet of the high country. They came down into the city from the west, entering through streets that grew progressively busier, the mountain smell of their clothing and the trail dust on the horses marking them as people who had come from somewhere difficult. At a livery near the federal district, they stabled the horses, and Lily took the carpet bag, and Jonah carried the canvas sack, and they walked through the late afternoon streets to the stone building near the courthouse that bore the seal of the United States Marshal's office. Inside, a young man at a desk looked up at them with the particular expression of someone whose job included assessing in 3 seconds whether the people in front of him were worth his supervisor's time. He had apparently 3 seconds of doubt. Jonah said with the flat, authoritative voice of a man who owned a business and dealt with difficult situations and was not in the habit of being managed by people who had not yet earned the right. We have evidence of a 30-year-old murder. The evidence includes a written confession by the man who committed it. The victim was a Colorado Territory resident, and the murderer is a current elected official. We need to speak with Marshal Wilson immediately. The young man looked at them for a moment. Then he got up and went through the door behind him. 4 minutes later, they were in Marshal Thomas Wilson's office. Wilson was a large man in his late 50s, gray-haired and broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been formed by years of looking at difficult things without looking away. He listened to Jonah's account of the situation with his hands flat on the desk and his eyes moving between the two of them with the professional assessment of a man who knew how to read reliability. When Jonah finished, Lily placed the journal pages on the desk. Wilson read them. He read them twice. He turned to the formula portfolio, examined the pages, compared the handwriting to the notations on Tom's architectural plans that Lily had folded into the portfolio alongside the stolen documents. He looked up. "Gerald Pike," he said, "the councilman." "Yes," Lily said. "You took these from his private office." "Yes." "Which is breaking and entering." "Yes." Wilson looked at her with the expression of a man deciding where the weight fell. "And the third party, Tom Fletcher, he's willing to testify. He's been willing to testify for 30 years. He's been waiting for someone with the jurisdiction to make it matter." Wilson sat back in his chair. He looked at the journal pages again, at the date, at the entry that read, "It is done. Stone is dead. The formula is in my possession." "Pike has relationships at the territorial level," he said. "This won't be simple." "We're not asking for simple," Jonah said. "We're asking for justice for my father, for Michael Brennan, who died trying to report what he'd seen, for Walter Murphy and anyone else who got in the way in the 30 years between, for a town that has been watching a murderer run its governance since before most of its residents arrived." Wilson looked at him. Then he stood and he reached for the gun belt on the peg behind his desk, and he said, "I'll need 6 deputies. We leave at first light tomorrow." He looked at the documents on his desk. "These are secured in the courthouse vault tonight. You two get cleaned up and get some rest." He paused. "Tomorrow we finish this." They stayed that night in a modest hotel near the marshal's office, 2 rooms, the first walls between them in 4 days. Lily bathed and changed into the cleaner of her 2 dresses and sat at the small desk in her room with the lamp lit and wrote a letter to Kate, knowing it would arrive after they did, but writing it anyway because there were things she needed to set down in order to believe they were real. She wrote, "We have it. Wilson is coming. Be careful until we arrive. Watch over Tommy." She wrote, "I think I know what happened to Michael Brennan. I will tell you when I see you." She stopped and looked at the flame in the lamp for a moment. She wrote, "Whatever I find out, the tools still work. He taught me right. That's what matters." She sealed the letter. She went to the window and stood looking at the Denver streets below the gas lamps, already lit, the evening foot traffic, moving with the particular purposeful ease of people in a city who did not have to be watchful at every corner. There was a knock at the door. Jonah stood in the hallway, changed the trail dust, gone looking younger without the accumulated weight of the mountain days on him, or perhaps looking more like himself because the weight he'd been carrying longer than the trail had been set down somewhere between the marshal's office and this corridor. "I wanted to make sure you were all right," he said. "I am," she said. "Are you?" He considered the question with the seriousness he applied to things that deserved it. "I read my father's handwriting today on documents I'd never seen. I saw what he was working toward and what it was worth and what was taken from him. And then I watched a federal marshal read the written confession of the man who took it." He paused. "I am better than I was this morning. which is better than I have been in a considerable time. He would be proud, Lily said. What you built, what you protected, the way you raised Tommy. He never met Tommy. He died before my brother had children. I know. I meant the way you would have made him proud. The way you are the kind of man who makes people proud whether or not those people are still here to see it. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and she stood at the window, and the distance between them was exactly the distance that it was. Tomorrow, he said, when this is over, when Pike and Kane are in custody, and Tommy is home, and the workshop is safe, I want to say something to you properly, with time enough to say it right. He looked at her directly. I want you to know that this is not a temporary feeling. What I said on the mountain. I want you to know that it has the quality of permanence. She felt the weight of it settle somewhere in her chest, not heavy, but present the way a tool settled into the hand that knew how to hold it. I want that too, she said, to have time to say it properly. He nodded. Tomorrow then. He went back to his room. She turned off the lamp and lay in the dark, and she thought about permanence, about the things that lasted and the things that only appeared to, about formulas for making wood survive, whether about old men who kept rolled papers for 30 years against the day the right person arrived, about children who asked direct questions about bruises, about the particular sound of a plane moving over good wood, about everything that was waiting for them in Silverwood when the sun came up. She thought about a man named Michael Brennan who had died alone in the dark trying to reach a life he knew, and about the man who had found him and taken his name and somehow through 30 years of living inside a borrowed story had taught a daughter real things, true things, things that had worked in the dark of Pike's office and on the face of a mountain and in a child's afternoon of multiplication tables and in the workshop of a man whose walls were coming down. She thought I am his daughter whether he was my father or not. She thought I am going back to find the truth of it either way. She thought I am going home. And then she slept. They rode back into Silverwood at noon, 8 horses on the main street. Wilson and his 6 deputies in federal coats that made the town go quiet the way towns went quiet, when authority arrived from outside the particular silence of people who had been waiting for something without knowing they were waiting. Lily and Jonah rode at the front, trails dusty and road-worn, and behind them the mountains stood in their permanent, indifferent beauty unchanged by everything that had happened beneath them. Wilson had said little on the ride from Denver. He was a man who did his thinking before he acted and his talking after, and what he had to do today required neither conversation nor preparation. He had read the journal. He had read it twice. He knew what kind of man he was going to arrest, and he knew what 30 years of that kind of man did to a town, and he rode with the focused calm of someone who had been in this particular business long enough to know that the most important thing was not to hurry it. Pike's office was on the 2nd floor of the town hall. Pike was in it. He looked up when Wilson's boots reached the top of the stairs, and in the 3 seconds before his expression arranged itself into something controlled, Lily saw everything that 30 years of careful management had been built to conceal. The calculation, the assessment of exits, the moment when a man who has always believed himself untouchable understands for the first time that the walls have come down. He looked past Wilson. He saw Lily. He saw Jonah. His face did something that was not quite fear and not quite recognition, but lived exactly between them. Wilson set the journal on Pike's desk. The pages she had taken now returned as evidence rather than secrets. Pike looked at his own handwriting and said nothing. Gerald Pike, Wilson said. You are under arrest for the murder of Isaiah Stone on the 14th of September, 1858, and for the theft of intellectual property belonging to the estate of Isaiah Stone and to Michael Brennan. You have the right to speak to a lawyer before you are transported to Denver. Pike looked at the journal for a long moment. Then he looked at Jonah. Your father, he said and stopped. Don't, Jonah said. His voice was very quiet. Whatever you were going to say, don't. Wilson nodded to the deputy on his left. It was in the street below that Kane made his move. He had been watching from the doorway of the lumber office across the way, and when he saw Pike being walked down the town hall steps in handcuffs, he ran. Not toward the livery where his horse was stabled, which would have been the logical choice, but east along the main street toward the edge of town, the instinctive flight of a man whose planning had always been about acquisition rather than escape, who had never seriously imagined needing an exit because he had never seriously imagined being caught. He got 40 yards. He got 40 yards, and then the street stopped him. Not Wilson's deputies, though two of them were moving. The street itself stopped him, or rather, the people on it, the dozen men and women who had been going about their noon errands when the federal horses arrived, who had watched from doorways and boardwalk edges, with the careful attention of people who had learned that watching was safer than involvement, who had been watching this particular man do particular things to this particular town for years without the means or the protection to do anything about it. Tom Fletcher stepped out of the forge doorway. He was 70 years old and bent at the shoulders, and his hammer was not in his hand, but he stepped into the street and he stood there. A rancher named Caldwell, who had lost a timber supply contract to Kane Industries 4 years ago, through means that had never been proven, stepped off the boardwalk. The doctor who read his letters all through dinner at Murphy's rooms stepped out of his office above the general store. Kate Murphy came through the front door of the boarding house and stood on the porch with her hands at her sides and her eyes on Vincent Kane, and her expression was the expression of a woman who had been waiting 5 years for this particular moment and intended to be present for it completely. In her right hand, resting easy at her side, was her husband's pistol. She had kept it clean. She had kept it loaded. She had been waiting 5 years for a reason to take it off the shelf, one by one, two by two, until there were 15 people standing in the main street of Silverwood, Colorado territory in the autumn noon light, not speaking, not threatening, simply standing between Vincent, Kane, and wherever he thought he was going. Kane stopped. He looked at the people, at Tom Fletcher, at Kate Murphy on the porch, at the faces of the town he had spent a decade managing through money and fear and the particular leverage of a man who controlled what other people needed. He looked at Lily. She did not look away. Wilson's deputy reached him 30 seconds later. The handcuffs made a sound that carried in the mountain air. Tommy was at the workshop when they arrived. He had heard the horses on the main street and come to the workshop door and stood there watching the federal procession with the serious attention of a child who understood that something important was happening, even if he did not yet know what. When he saw Jonah dismount, he stood still for exactly 1 second. Then he ran. He covered the distance between the workshop door and the street in the way children covered distances when they had stopped calculating, and simply moved all forward motion and no hesitation, and Jonah caught him and went down on one knee in the dust and held him with a complete absence of reserve that had not been present in him, that had not been available in him since before Anna died and the curtains came down. Tommy did not speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was muffled against Jonah's shoulder. "You came back." "I said I would." "Uncle Jonah." A pause. "Did you ever make a promise you couldn't keep?" Jonah was quiet for a moment. A real moment, the kind that held actual thought rather than the instinct toward reassurance. "Once," he said, "I promised Anna I would be home before Ruth's birthday. I was on a commission in Boulder, and the weather turned, and I didn't make it. Ruth was 3. She didn't know. But Anna knew, and I have carried it a long time." He pulled back slightly to look at Tommy's face. "That is the only promise I have broken, and I will not break another." Tommy looked at him with a direct assessment that had been one of his most consistent qualities since the day he asked a stranger if someone had hit her. Then he nodded once with the gravity of a child accepting something real. He looked at Lily over Jonah's shoulder. "Are you staying?" he asked. She looked at Jonah. He looked at her. "Yes," she said, "I'm staying." That evening, after Wilson had taken his prisoners and his deputies back toward Denver, after Kate had fed half the town in the Murphy's room's dining room, in what became, without anyone planning it, a kind of celebration after Tommy had fallen asleep at the dinner table and been carried to his room, Lily went alone to the workshop. She did not light the main lantern. She took the small lamp from the hook by the door and carried it to the workbench and set it down, and in its warm circle she worked for an hour. She took from her coat pocket the locket, the one she had found in Pike's hidden portfolio, alongside the formula pages, a detail she had not told anyone yet, not even Jonah, because she had needed time to understand what it meant. A small brass locket oval, the size of a large coin. Inside it, a photograph of a young man in his late 20s taken in the formal style of the early daguerreotype, the kind a man had made before a long journey, the kind meant to be carried by someone who would miss him. The man had green eyes. Her eyes. The exact shade, the exact shape, the way they sat in the face. On the back of the locket, scratched in a careful hand, MBEB, Philadelphia, 1857. Michael Brennan, her father. Not the man who raised her, not the man who taught her to read grain and cut with the tension of the wood and hold a chisel as if it were an extension of the hand rather than a separate tool. Her actual father. The man whose name she carried without knowing it was borrowed, whose tools she had kept sharp without knowing they were his inheritance. He had made it as far as the mine before Pike's Reach found him. The locket had been on his body when someone else found him, and that someone else had understood what it meant to have a dead man's identity available in a territory where no one checked too carefully, and had traveled east with a new name and a set of tools in 30 years of silence. Lily set the locket on the workbench. She selected a piece of oak from the off-cut box. White oak, dense-grained, the kind that lasted. She found the smallest gouged chisel in her father's tool roll and the mallet, and she worked slowly and carefully the way she worked when the work mattered more than the speed. She carved the letters one at a time, each one deliberate. Michael Brennan, carpenter. Philadelphia, 1833. Colorado, 1858. He was not forgotten. She set the locket into a recess she had prepared for it. In the upper right corner of the wood fitted it so it sat flush permanent. Then she took the small tin of waterproofing treatment from the shelf, the formula she had restored to the hands it belonged to, and she applied it to the surface of the wood in long, even strokes. The grain emerged as the treatment went on. The figure in the oak, the pattern that had been inside the wood since the tree was alive, the particular record of every year the tree had grown and every season it had survived. Jonah was standing in the workshop doorway when she finished. She did not know how long he had been there. He was leaning against the frame with his arms crossed and the lamplight on his face and the expression of a man watching something he did not want to interrupt. She looked at the plaque, at the locket set into the oak, at the letters she had cut by hand in the light of a single lamp. He deserves someone to know, she said. Jonah crossed the workshop and stood beside her and looked at what she had made. Yes, he said, he did. They stood together in the lamplight, the workshop around them, quiet and smelling of oak and linseed and the particular warm mineral smell of the waterproofing formula, the formula that had come home at last to the hands that had made it. After a long time, Jonah said, I want to ask you something. Properly. Not tonight because tonight has had enough in it, but soon. She looked at him. I know what you're going to ask, she said. I know you know. Ask it soon, she said. I'll say yes. Something moved across his face that was not the controlled flatness, not the managed distance, not the grief keeping the curtains closed. It was something older and quieter than any of those things, something that had been waiting in him for a long time for the right conditions to grow. He picked up the small oak plaque with both hands the way he picked up fine work. He carried it to the eastern wall of the workshop where the morning light would find it first, and he hung it there. Michael Brennan looked out from the locket at the workshop that bore the name of his partner's son, at the tools that his daughter had carried across half a continent without knowing whose hands had made them, at the formula on the wall of the wood that would last now because justice was slow, but it arrived. 18 months later, the sign above the workshop read, Stone and Brennan Carpentry. Established 1885. Master Woodworkers. Weatherproofing Treatment. Partners, J. Stone, Brennan Stone T. Fletcher. The lettering had been carved by Tommy, now 12, whose hands had found their proper channel at last. The sign was hung in white oak. The waterproofing treatment was applied in 3 coats. It would last 20 years. Lily stood in the doorway of the workshop in the Colorado autumn light, one hand resting on the frame, the other on the considerable swell of her middle 6 months along, and moving with the careful, deliberate balance of a woman who had learned to redistribute weight without losing her footing. The mountains behind the town were already showing their first snow on the high peaks, the seasonal announcement of permanence that she had come to find steadying rather than indifferent. Inside the workshop, Tommy was cutting mortises in a door frame with the concentration of someone for whom the work had become its own reward. The measurements were chalked on the wood in his own hand. He had checked them twice. Jonah came out of the workshop and stood beside her, his hands carrying the fine sawdust of cherry wood, his face carrying the particular ease of a man who had set down something heavy enough that the absence of it had changed how he stood. What are you thinking about it? He asked. About the sign, she said. Brennan is in it, both of them. The one who taught me and the one I came to find. Jonah looked at the sign, at Tommy inside, at the mountains. Your father said the wood has a memory, he said. He did. She paused. Both of them said it actually. Different words. Same idea. She thought about a man who had died in a dark mine trying to reach the people he loved, and about the man who had found him and carried his name east and raised a daughter in a borrowed life, and about what it meant that both of those men had given her the same thing. In the end, the knowledge that a material remembered what it used to be, that you worked with, what the wood wanted to do, that the grain told you the whole story if you were patient enough to read it. Lily Rose Brennan, Jonah said, which was not her name anymore, but he used it sometimes, the full name, when he meant something specifically about who she had been before Silverwood, rather than who she was inside it. What? She came with 11 cents, he said, with the particular dry delivery that had been emerging in him slowly over 18 months of curtains opening and changed everything. She looked at him. He was not quite smiling. He was doing the thing that was better than smiling, the thing that lived underneath it, the thing that had been there all along, waiting for the right conditions. She did Goiden, Lily said. The afternoon light came gold off the mountains and caught on the sign above the workshop door and the locket set into the oak plaque on the eastern wall inside. And somewhere in the high country, a hawk rode the thermal without effort, without fighting the air, moving with exactly what the wind wanted to do. The wood remembered.